I need to tell someone about this, even if it makes me sound paranoid or insane. Maybe especially if it does. What happened wasn't supernatural or impossible. That's what makes it worse. Everything I'm about to describe could happen to anyone, and that's the thought that keeps me awake most nights now. I suppose I should start by explaining how I ended up on the dark web in the first place. It wasn't for anything dramatic or illegal. No drugs, no stolen credit cards, nothing like that. The truth is almost embarrassingly mundane. I was bored and curious. That combination has probably ruined more lives than any deliberate malice ever could. I'd been working remotely for about 18 months, doing content writing for various marketing agencies, the kind of work where you churn out blog posts about dental hygiene and insurance policies, trying to make the supremely dull sound vaguely interesting. My flat in Manchester was small, affordable, and utterly soul-destroying in its beige uniformity. Most days I'd wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, and not speak to another human being until I went to bed again. The isolation does something to you after a while. You start looking for connection in strange places, start convincing yourself that the internet's darker corners must be more interesting than your reality. I'd read about the dark web for years, obviously, everyone has. The usual sensationalist rubbish in newspapers, the occasional documentary that makes it all seem impossibly sinister and complex. But I'd also stumbled across more measured articles explaining that most of it was fairly boring. Political dissidents communicating safely, whistleblowers, people in oppressive countries, accessing uncensored information. That aspect actually appealed to me. I liked the idea of an internet that wasn't entirely corporate, where algorithms weren't constantly trying to sell me things or predict my behavior. Getting access wasn't particularly difficult. I'm not technically minded, can barely troubleshoot my own Wi-Fi when it acts up. But there are guides everywhere if you know where to look. Took me maybe an afternoon to get everything sorted. And then I was there. The hidden internet, the dark web, the place parents warn their children about. And God, was it disappointing at first. Mostly, it looked like websites from 1998, all text-based and clunky. Forums discussing privacy rights and encryption. Marketplaces that were obviously dodgy, but presented themselves with this bizarre corporate professionalism, complete with customer service policies and user ratings. I spent hours just clicking around, reading things not really engaging. It felt like wandering through a massive, dimly lit car boot sale, where everyone was trying very hard to look mysterious and dangerous, but mostly just seemed a bit sad. I didn't buy anything, didn't sell anything, didn't even create accounts on most of the sites I visited. I was a tourist, essentially. A spectator. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. For about 3 months, this became my evening routine. Finish work, make dinner, spend a few hours exploring. I found forums dedicated to incredibly niche topics, people discussing conspiracy theories I'd never heard of, groups sharing banned books, communities built around philosophical ideas that conventional society had rejected. Some of it was genuinely interesting. Most of it was rubbish. All of it felt illicit in a way that was mildly thrilling without being genuinely risky. Then I found the invitation board. It wasn't called that officially. The site had some pretentious Latin name I've since forgotten. But essentially, it was a message board where people posted invitations to private sites deeper in the network. Most of them were obvious scams or honeypots. Exclusive investment opportunities, definitely fraud. Premium content access, probably illegal pornography or worse. I scrolled past those without a second thought. I might have been bored, but I wasn't stupid. But occasionally there'd be invitations that seemed more legitimate, isn't the right word. More intriguing, maybe. invitations to private discussion groups about art or philosophy, invitations to closed networks where journalists and activists coordinated. One person was even trying to organize an anonymous book club, which I found oddly charming. The invitation that caught my attention was simple. Just a few lines of text, looking for people who feel disconnected, not selling anything, not asking for anything. Just want to talk to others who understand what it's like to be lonely in a crowded world. If you're tired of performing for an audience, tired of curating yourself, maybe we can just be honest for a while. Limited spaces. Below it was a link and a passcode. I stared at that message for a long time. It felt like it had been written specifically for me, which I recognized as exactly the response it was designed to provoke. Anyone feeling isolated and aimless would read those words and think, yes, that's exactly how I feel. It was manipulative in its specificity. But I clicked anyway. The link took me to what looked like a private chat room. Very basic interface, just a black screen with green text. There were maybe 8 or 9 people in there when I joined, all using anonymous handles. Nobody said hello or acknowledged my arrival. They were mid-conversation, discussing whether genuine human connection was even possible anymore, or whether we'd all become too fractured, too performative, too aware of ourselves. I lurked for about 20 minutes, just reading. The conversation was surprisingly thoughtful. No trolling, no aggression, just people being remarkably honest about their loneliness and dissatisfaction. Someone talked about how they'd realized they didn't actually like any of their friends. They just went through the motions of friendship because the alternative was being completely alone. Someone else described the feeling of being hollow, like they were just a collection of responses and reactions with nothing genuine underneath. Eventually, I started typing. Nothing profound, just agreeing with something someone had said about how exhausting it was to constantly maintain a persona. The response was immediate and warm. Several people welcomed me, said they were glad I joined, asked gentle questions about my life. We talked for hours that night, about loneliness, about meaning, about whether happiness was even a realistic goal, or just something we'd been conditioned to pursue. It sounds pretentious written down like this, but in the moment it felt significant. These people understood something about the world that my real-life acquaintances didn't, or maybe they were just willing to admit it. I went back the next night, and the night after. Within a week, I was spending 3 or 4 hours there every evening. The group stayed small, never more than a dozen people, and we began to recognize each other's writing styles, our particular preoccupations. A woman who I mentally nicknamed Red talked endlessly about how she felt like she was disappearing, becoming less real every day. Someone called Vertex was obsessed with the idea that modern life was designed to make us miserable, that every system and structure was built to generate just enough hope to keep us participating while ensuring we never actually achieve satisfaction. Dark stuff, but articulated with real intelligence. I became closer with a user called Morton. He was the one who'd posted the original invitation, though I didn't realize that until later. His messages were always thoughtful, always asked good questions. He had this way of making you feel heard that was intoxicating when you'd spent months barely speaking to anyone. We started having longer one-on-one conversations, separate from the main group. He asked about my life. I told him about the content writing, the isolation, the feeling that I was just drifting through my 20s without purpose or direction. He shared similar stories, a job he hated, a city he felt trapped in, the sense that everyone around him was pretending life made sense when clearly it didn't. After a few weeks, he asked if I'd be interested in something more substantial. The main chat room was fine, he said, but it was still just talk. Just people complaining into the void, achieving nothing. He was part of a smaller group, he explained. People who wanted to actually do something about their disconnection. Not anything dramatic or illegal, he assured me. Just experiments in authentic living. Ways to break out of the numbing routines that were slowly killing us all. I should have been suspicious. I should have asked more questions. But I was so desperate for something real, something that mattered, that I just said yes. He sent me another link, another passcode. This new space was different. Only 4 people besides Morton and myself. The conversations were more intense, more personal. We were encouraged to share details about our actual lives, no real names or identifying information, but specifics about our daily routines, our fears, our homes. The idea, as Morton explained it, was that we needed to be truly vulnerable with each other before we could move forward together. It felt like therapy almost, confessional. I told these strangers things I'd never told anyone, about how some days I didn't leave my flat at all, didn't even open the curtains, about how I'd sometimes catch myself in the mirror and barely recognize the person looking back, about the persistent, low-level terror that I'd wasted my life and it was too late to do anything about it. They responded with similar confessions. Red talked about her habit of shoplifting, not because she needed anything, but because it was the only time she felt real. Vertex described elaborate fantasies about abandoning his life entirely, just walking away from his flat and his job and becoming nobody. Another member, someone who went by Cypher, admitted to following strangers sometimes, learning their routines, imagining what their lives were like. That should have been a warning sign, that last one especially. But in the context of this group, where we were all confessing our darkest thoughts, it just seemed like more honesty, more vulnerability. Morton suggested we do an exercise. Each of us would make a small change to our routine, something that broke our normal pattern. Nothing illegal or harmful, just something unexpected. Then we'd report back about how it felt. I changed my walking route to the corner shop, started going at odd hours, 3 in the morning sometimes, when the streets were empty and everything felt slightly unreal. It was stupid, but it did make me feel something. Made the familiar streets of my neighborhood seem new and strange. The others reported similar experiences. Red started talking to strangers on public transport. Vertex began leaving his flat unlocked during the day. Cypher started recording videos of himself, monologues about his life, and leaving them playing on his laptop screen while he went out. It sounds insane now, writing it all down, but at the time it felt like progress, like we were taking control of our lives in small ways. Then Morton suggested something bigger. He said we'd reached a point where we trusted each other completely, where we understood each other. And he wanted to propose an experiment in radical honesty and trust. Each of us would share our real address, not our names, not any other identifying details, just our addresses. And then, at some point over the next month, one of us would visit one of the others unannounced, just show up at their door. The idea, he explained, was to force a moment of genuine human connection. No hiding behind screens, no carefully curated responses. Just 2 people who truly understood each other's loneliness, meeting face to face. It would be uncomfortable, yes, maybe even frightening. But wasn't that the point? Wasn't real connection supposed to be frightening? I can't properly explain why I agreed to this. Part of me knew it was insane. But another part, the part that had been isolated and lonely for so long, desperately wanted to believe this could be meaningful, that these people actually understood me, that this could be the start of something real. So I shared my address. We all did. 6 addresses, scattered across England. Manchester, Leeds, Brighton, London, Birmingham, Newcastle. We posted them in the chat, and Morton said that was it. The experiment had begun any day now, any time. One of us might get a visitor, or we might be the visitor ourselves. The waiting was terrible. Every noise in the corridor outside my flat made me freeze. Every time I went to the shops, I found myself scanning faces, wondering if Red or Vertex or Cypher might be there. Watching me, I stopped sleeping properly, started keeping a knife in my bedside drawer, even though I knew how ridiculous that was. A week passed. Nothing happened. 2 weeks. Still nothing. I went back to the chat room regularly, but Morton had gone quiet. So had Cypher. The others still chatted occasionally, but the energy had changed. We were all waiting, all anxious, and it poisoned the conversations. Red eventually admitted she regretted sharing her address, asked if we could just call the whole thing off. Vertex agreed. I agreed, but Morton didn't respond. On day 19, I got home from a rare trip to the shops to find my front door open. Not broken, not forced, just open, unlocked. I stood in the corridor for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Call the police, go inside, run. Eventually, I pushed the door open and stepped into my flat. Everything looked normal. Nothing obviously stolen or disturbed. My laptop was still on my desk. My television was still on the wall. I checked every room, every cupboard, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing. Nobody. But someone had been there. Someone had been in my flat while I was out. Someone had opened my door, or had a key, or picked the lock, and had been inside, touching my things, breathing my air. I found it, eventually, after nearly an hour of searching. On my laptop, a new folder on the desktop, just labeled with my address. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, of me leaving my flat, walking to the shops, sitting in the window of a cafe I sometimes went to, standing outside in the early morning hours during my routine breaking walks. Some were from weeks ago, from before I'd even shared my address. Someone had been watching me the entire time. And at the bottom of the folder, one final image, a photograph of my front door taken from inside my flat, taken based on the light coming through the window, earlier that same day while I'd been out. Below the image, a text file, just one sentence. We understand your loneliness now. I didn't sleep in my flat that night, stayed at a hotel, paid cash, didn't tell anyone where I was going. Called the police the next morning, but what could I tell them? That I'd met people on the dark web and invited them into my life? That I'd voluntarily shared my address with strangers? The officer was sympathetic, but pointed out that no crime had technically been committed. Someone had photographs of me in public spaces, legal. Someone had entered my flat but hadn't stolen or damaged anything. Hard to prove, impossible to investigate. I changed my locks, changed my routine, stopped going on the dark web entirely. But the fear didn't leave, because here's what I realized, lying awake in that hotel room, staring at the ceiling. Everything Morton had asked us to share, every vulnerability we'd confessed, every detail about our lives. It wasn't about connection. It was about access. It was about learning our patterns, our fears, our weaknesses. And the photographs proved they'd been watching me long before I shared my address, which meant they'd found me through the original chat room, somehow traced me through my connection, or my writing style, or something I'd carelessly mentioned. I thought I was being anonymous, but I'd been visible the entire time. I moved to a different city 3 months later. Different flat, different job, different routines. I tell people I just fancied a change. Nobody questions it. but I still find myself checking over my shoulder sometimes. Still freeze when I see someone taking photographs on their phone. Still wonder whether Morton and the others are still out there, still watching, still collecting their little experiments in loneliness and vulnerability. The worst part isn't the fear though. The worst part is that some small broken piece of me still misses those conversations, still remembers what it felt like to be understood, even if that understanding was being weaponized against me. That's what loneliness does to you. Makes you vulnerable in ways you don't even recognize until it's too late. Makes you trade safety for the illusion of connection. Makes you open doors that should stay locked. I never found out what happened to the others. Whether they got visits too. Whether they moved away. Whether they're still out there somewhere, waiting for a knock on their door that might never come. Or maybe Morton was one of them. Maybe Red or Vertex or Cypher was him all along, playing multiple roles, manufacturing the illusion of community to make us trust him. I'll never know. All I know is that I was so desperate to feel less alone that I invited monsters into my life and called them friends. And now I'm alone anyway, but afraid as well, which is probably what they wanted all along. When someone offers you cash in hand for courier work and emphasizes that discretion is more important than efficiency, there's usually a reason they can't use legitimate delivery companies. I probably should have questioned why they needed a driver who didn't ask questions. But when you're 3 weeks behind on rent and your car's about to be repossessed, you don't spend much time analyzing red flags. The job came through a contact at the pub, where I'd been drowning my sorrows after losing my warehouse position in Coventry. Manufacturing jobs had been disappearing from the area for months, and I'd finally been caught up in another round of redundancies. At 42, starting over wasn't exactly appealing, especially when most employers seem to prefer younger candidates who would work for less money. My drinking buddy Steve mentioned that he knew someone who needed reliable drivers for what he called special deliveries around the Midlands. The work paid considerably better than typical courier jobs, but it required complete discretion and the ability to follow specific instructions without asking unnecessary questions. Steve arranged a meeting with the contact, a well-dressed man who introduced himself simply as Martin. He explained that his business involved delivering sensitive materials to clients who valued privacy above all else. The packages were always small, the destinations were always specific, and the timing was always crucial. Martin emphasized that successful drivers needed to understand that they were being paid for reliability and silence rather than curiosity. The clients served by his operation often dealt with confidential business matters that required absolute discretion from everyone involved in the delivery process. The pay was attractive enough to solve my immediate financial problems, and the work seemed straightforward enough. I would receive text messages with addresses and specific instructions, collect packages from designated locations, and deliver them to the specified destinations without interacting unnecessarily with anyone involved. My first few deliveries were exactly as Martin had described. Small packages collected from ordinary-looking locations and delivered to residential addresses across Warwickshire and Staffordshire. The recipients were typically middle-aged professionals who seemed unsurprised by the deliveries and signed for them without conversation. The packages themselves were unremarkable. Small parcels wrapped in brown paper with no obvious identifying marks or return addresses. The delivery instructions were always precise about timing and approach, but nothing seemed particularly suspicious about the routine business transactions I was facilitating. However, I began noticing patterns in the delivery locations that suggested the operation involved more than typical business correspondence. Many of the pickup points were in areas that seemed inappropriate for legitimate commercial activities, and some of the delivery addresses were to properties that appeared to be unoccupied. The timing requirements for deliveries were also becoming more specific and unusual. I was often instructed to deliver packages at odd hours, or to leave them in particular locations, rather than handing them directly to recipients. Some deliveries required waiting until specific people left properties before approaching the delivery addresses. When I mentioned these unusual requirements to Martin, he explained that many of his clients operated businesses that required unconventional scheduling due to the sensitive nature of their work. Privacy concerns often necessitated deliveries outside normal business hours to avoid unwanted attention. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for legitimate business activities that required high levels of confidentiality. Corporate espionage and competitive intelligence were common concerns in many industries, and companies often took extraordinary measures to protect sensitive information. Around the 4th week of my employment with Martin's operation, I began receiving delivery instructions that involved significantly more complex logistics. Instead of simple package deliveries, I was asked to observe specific locations before making deliveries, documenting who was present and what activities were taking place. These surveillance requirements were presented as security measures necessary to ensure safe delivery of sensitive materials. Martin explained that many clients had concerns about industrial espionage or corporate surveillance, and delivery drivers needed to confirm that locations were secure before leaving valuable packages. The observation work was more time-consuming than simple deliveries, but it was also more interesting than typical courier duties. I found myself learning about the daily routines and activities of various people and businesses across the region, building detailed knowledge of locations and schedules that helped me plan more effective delivery strategies. However, the information I was gathering during these surveillance activities seemed to go far beyond what would be necessary for simple delivery security. I was documenting personal relationships, family circumstances, and lifestyle patterns that appeared irrelevant to ensuring safe package delivery. Some of the surveillance assignments involved observing residential properties where no deliveries were scheduled, suggesting that the intelligence gathering had become an end in itself rather than a means of facilitating deliveries. I was effectively conducting systematic surveillance of people who had no apparent connection to the delivery operation. When I questioned why surveillance was required for locations where no deliveries were planned, Martin explained that understanding the broader context of client activities was necessary for maintaining operational security. The delivery network served people whose business relationships were complex and sometimes required careful coordination. Around the 6th week of my involvement with the operation, Martin began providing me with specific devices and software that would enhance my surveillance capabilities. Small cameras that could be placed discreetly in various locations, recording devices that could capture conversations, and tracking applications that would monitor people's movements. These tools were presented as necessary equipment for advanced delivery security, allowing me to ensure that packages reached their intended recipients without being intercepted or observed by unauthorized parties. The technology would help me document that deliveries had been completed successfully and that client security had been maintained. The surveillance equipment was remarkably sophisticated, suggesting that Martin's operation had access to resources that went far beyond what would be available to typical courier services. The devices were professional grade and included features that would be useful for comprehensive intelligence gathering, rather than simple delivery confirmation. I began using this equipment to document not just delivery activities, but the broader circumstances and activities of the people and locations I was observing. The information I was gathering was becoming a comprehensive intelligence database, about the personal and professional lives of people across the region. Martin seemed particularly interested in information about people's vulnerabilities and potential leverage points. He wanted detailed reports about financial difficulties, relationship problems, health issues, and other personal circumstances that might be useful for understanding how different people could be influenced or manipulated. This focus on psychological and social intelligence made me increasingly uncomfortable about the true purpose of the operation. The delivery work seemed to be providing cover for systematic intelligence gathering that had little to do with facilitating legitimate business transactions. When I tried to discuss these concerns with Martin, he reminded me that I had been gathering detailed intelligence about people and their circumstances for several weeks. This information was valuable and sensitive, and my knowledge of the operation's methods and targets made me an integral part of their security considerations. He also began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that he could not have gathered through our professional relationship. References to my financial situation, daily routine, and personal relationships suggested that I'd become a target of the same surveillance techniques I was using to gather intelligence about others. The surveillance of my activities became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my communications and movements were being monitored and documented. The equipment and techniques I was using to observe others were apparently being used to observe me as well. I realized that the delivery work had been used to recruit me into systematic surveillance operations that targeted vulnerable people for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate courier services. The packages I had been delivering were probably intelligence reports rather than business correspondence. The surveillance equipment I had been given was being used to gather detailed personal information about people who were being assessed for potential exploitation. My role had been to provide the intelligence needed to identify psychological vulnerabilities and leverage points that could be used for manipulation or control. When I attempted to withdraw from the operation entirely, Martin pointed out that I possessed detailed knowledge of surveillance techniques and had extensive information about people who were being monitored. This made me both a valuable asset and a potential security risk that could not simply be dismissed. The surveillance of my personal activities intensified after I tried to end my involvement with the operation. Martin's organization began sending me detailed information about my daily routine, social interactions, and personal vulnerabilities to demonstrate that they could apply their intelligence gathering techniques to my own life. I tried reporting my concerns to the police, but discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The courier work had been presented as legitimate delivery services. The surveillance equipment could be justified as security measures, and the intelligence gathering could be explained as necessary business research. Martin's operation continued to contact me sporadically over the following months, offering additional delivery work and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active and comprehensive. I never determined what the organization was ultimately using the detailed personal intelligence for or who was directing their surveillance activities. The systematic gathering of information about people's vulnerabilities and personal circumstances, combined with sophisticated surveillance equipment and techniques, suggested capabilities that extended far beyond legitimate courier services. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for exploiting people's financial desperation to recruit unwitting participants in comprehensive surveillance operations. They understood how to present intelligence gathering as legitimate delivery work, while using the couriers as both surveillance operatives and potential targets for the same techniques. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my need for employment had been transformed into participation in systematic invasion of privacy for people who had no knowledge they were being monitored. The courier work had been a recruitment method designed to identify people desperate enough to ignore ethical concerns in exchange for steady income. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar courier and delivery services, offering cash work that pays well for what appears to be straightforward delivery assignments. The positions they advertise always emphasize discretion over efficiency, always involve unusual timing and location requirements, and always include responsibilities that go beyond typical courier work. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other drivers have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate delivery services while actually participating in systematic surveillance operations that target vulnerable people for purposes they never intended to support. Do you have one of those repair people you trust? A plumber or electrician whose number you keep saved because they've done good work before and you know they'll turn up when they say they will? I had someone like that. A handyman called Steve who'd fixed various things around my house over the past few years. A leaking tap, some dodgy wiring, a bathroom fan that had stopped working. Reliable, reasonably priced, the sort of person you're grateful to have found in a world where tradespeople are often impossible to pin down. I gave him a key to my house once, just for convenience, whilst he worked on a job when I couldn't be there. That single decision is why I now know my kitchen looks different at 3 a.m. than it does during the day. Why I've seen footage of my bedroom that I definitely didn't record, and why my home address appears on a website that charges people for live access to spaces they have no right to see. I'm a physiotherapist working at a clinic in Sheffield. Been there for about 7 years. I live in a semi-detached house in one of the suburbs, the kind of area where people know their neighbours vaguely, but mostly keep to themselves. It's a decent house, nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I've worked hard to afford it. I live alone, which I've always preferred. The freedom to keep my own schedule, the peace and quiet after dealing with patients all day. Steve first did some work for me about 3 years ago. I'd found him through a recommendation from a colleague whose bathroom he'd renovated. He'd come round to fix a persistent leak under my kitchen sink that I'd been ignoring for too long. He was punctual, polite, did the job efficiently, and charged a fair price. Over the following years, I called him back for various other bits and pieces, replacing light fixtures, fixing a loose banister, installing some shelving in the spare room. Last autumn, I needed some electrical work done in the hallway. A ceiling light had started flickering worryingly, and I wanted it sorted properly rather than just replacing the bulb and hoping for the best. Steve came round to assess the job and said it would take most of an afternoon. The problem was I had several patient appointments scheduled that day and couldn't take time off. Steve suggested I could leave him a key, and he let himself in and out, locking up properly when he finished. He'd done this for other clients before, he said, and it made things easier than trying to coordinate schedules. I hesitated slightly. It's never comfortable giving someone access to your home when you're not there. But I'd known Steve for years at this point, and he'd never given me any reason to doubt his professionalism. I agreed, and left a spare key under the back doormat with instructions about which light was the problem. The work was done exactly as promised. When I got home that evening, the light was fixed, the key was back under the mat, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Steve sent a text to confirm he'd finished, and I transferred the payment that evening. Simple, professional, Exactly the kind of smooth transaction that makes you feel you've made the right choice in tradespeople. About 2 weeks later, I started noticing things that seemed slightly off. Nothing major, just small details that didn't quite match how I remembered leaving them. A kitchen cupboard door that I was sure I'd closed was standing open. The living room curtains were pulled slightly wider apart than I usually positioned them. A throw cushion on the sofa had moved from one end to the other. I put it down to tiredness and distraction. I'd been working long hours covering for a colleague on sick leave, and it's easy to forget small actions when your mind is occupied with other things. Everyone has moments where they can't quite remember whether they've done something or just intended to. But the occurrences continued. More cupboards left open. Lights turned on in rooms I was certain I'd left dark. My bedroom door standing ajar when I always closed it fully. The bathroom bin moved from its usual spot by the sink to underneath the window. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Then I noticed something more concrete. I have a small jewelry box on my bedroom dresser, just costume pieces mostly, nothing valuable. The box has a particular way I arrange it. Necklaces on one side, earrings on the other, a few rings in a little compartment at the back. One morning, I found everything mixed together, the necklaces tangled with the earrings, the rings scattered throughout. I hadn't touched that box in over a week. That's when I started to suspect someone had been entering my house. Not to steal, nothing was missing as far as I could tell, but simply to be there, to move through the space and disturb things in small ways that made their presence known. It felt deliberate, like someone wanted me to realize my home wasn't as private as I believed. I checked all the doors and windows, looking for signs of forced entry. Everything was secure and undamaged. The locks showed no evidence of tampering. There was no obvious explanation for how someone could be getting in, unless they had a key. And the only person outside my immediate family who'd ever had access to my key was Steve. I tried to dismiss the thought. Steve was a professional tradesman with plenty of work, no reason to risk his reputation and livelihood by sneaking into clients' homes. But the timing fit. The disturbances had started after he'd used my key to do that electrical work, and he'd had ample opportunity to copy the key before returning it. I changed my locks anyway, just to be safe. It cost more than I'd hoped, but I needed to feel secure in my own home. For about a week afterwards, everything seemed normal. No more mysterious disturbances, no more items moved or lights left on. I felt relieved, convinced that changing the locks had solved whatever problem had existed, even if I never fully understood what it had been. Then one morning, I found a mug in my kitchen sink that I didn't recognize. Not one of mine, just a plain white mug, but definitely not from my cupboards. It was sitting in the sink, like someone had used it for tea or coffee and left it there to wash later. The casual domesticity of it made my skin crawl. Someone had been in my house, made themselves a drink, used a mug they'd brought with them, and left it behind deliberately. I called the police immediately. They came and took the mug for fingerprints, took a statement about the incidents I'd been experiencing, checked the house for any signs of how someone might be entering. They found nothing conclusive. The mug had been wiped clean. There were no marks on doors or windows, no sign of how access was being gained. The officer who responded suggested I install cameras inside the house, not just external security, but something that would capture anyone moving around inside. I did that the same day, setting up several small cameras in the hallway, kitchen, and living room, all connected to my phone so I'd receive alerts if they detected movement while I was out. For 3 days, the cameras showed nothing unusual. Just me leaving in the morning and returning in the evening, the house empty and undisturbed in between. I started to think maybe the mug had been enough. Maybe whoever was doing this had realized they'd been too obvious and had stopped. Then on the 4th day, I received a movement alert around 2 in the afternoon. I was with a patient at the time and couldn't check immediately. But as soon as I had a break, I pulled up the camera feed on my phone. The footage showed a figure moving through my house, walking casually from room to room as though they had every right to be there. It was Steve. I recognized him immediately despite the cap he was wearing. He moved through my kitchen, opened cupboards and peered inside, stood looking out of the living room window for a few minutes. He went upstairs beyond the range of my cameras and stayed there for about 20 minutes before coming back down and leaving through the front door. The whole visit lasted around 40 minutes. I felt sick watching it. This was someone I'd trusted, someone I'd paid for honest work, someone I'd given access to my home because I thought he was reliable and professional. And he'd been entering my house regularly, walking through my private spaces, doing God knows what whilst I was at work, and completely unaware. I saved the footage and took it straight to the police station when I finished work that evening. This time, they had clear evidence of a crime, an identifiable suspect. They visited Steve that evening and arrested him. When they searched his van, they found keys to around 30 different properties, all carefully labeled with addresses. My key was among them, freshly cut to match my new locks. He'd somehow obtained details of my new lock type and had a key made before I'd even realized the locks had been changed. But what they found at his house was worse. He had hard drives containing thousands of hours of video footage from inside people's homes. Not just footage of him walking through empty houses, but recordings from cameras he'd installed secretly during legitimate repair visits. Tiny cameras hidden in smoke detectors, air vents, light fixtures. Devices he'd placed while supposedly fixing problems, whilst homeowners trusted him to work unsupervised in their properties. The footage went back years, hundreds of homes across Sheffield and surrounding areas, all of them belonging to people who'd hired him for basic maintenance work and unknowingly given him opportunities to install surveillance equipment. The videos showed everything. People going about their daily lives, private moments they thought were completely unwitnessed, intimate details of how they lived when they believed they were alone. During questioning, Steve admitted he'd been selling access to these camera feeds on the dark web. He'd created accounts for each property, organized by location and type of residence, and charged subscription fees for people to watch live feeds from inside strangers' homes. Some buyers wanted to watch specific types of households. Others just wanted the voyeuristic thrill of observing people who had no idea they were being watched. A detective showed me the website where my home had been listed. It was organized like a streaming service, with thumbnail previews of different properties and descriptions of what viewers could expect to see. My house was categorized under single-occupant female residences, with notes about my work schedule and typical routine. The listing boasted about multiple camera angles and high video quality. The subscription data showed my feed had been purchased by around 40 different people over the months since Steve had installed the cameras. 40 strangers had been watching me move around my own home, had observed my private routines, had seen everything I did whilst thinking I was completely alone and unobserved. The thought of it made me feel violated in a way that was difficult to articulate. The detective explained that the cameras Steve had installed were sophisticated enough to be nearly impossible to find without knowing exactly what to look for. They were powered by the home's electrical system, so they didn't require battery changes. They used the home's internet connection to stream footage, but did so in ways that wouldn't show up obviously en route to traffic. Unless you were specifically looking for hidden surveillance equipment with professional detection tools, you'd never know they were there. It took a team of specialists most of a day to find and remove all the cameras from my house. There were 5 in total. 1 in a hallway smoke detector, 1 in a kitchen air vent, 1 in the living room lamp fixture, 1 in the bathroom extractor fan, and 1 in my bedroom ceiling light. 5 devices that had been watching me for months, recording everything, streaming it to paying subscribers who viewed my private life as entertainment. Steve was prosecuted and received a prison sentence, though it seemed inadequate given the scale of what he'd done and the number of people he'd violated. The investigation identified over 80 homes where he'd installed surveillance equipment, though they suspected there were more they never found. Many of his victims never knew what had happened because he'd removed the cameras himself after subscription interest waned, or before homeowners planned renovations that might uncover them. The website where the footage was sold was shut down, but police confirmed the videos had been downloaded by subscribers before they could seize the servers. Months of footage from my home existed in private collections, potentially being reshared through other platforms or simply kept for personal viewing. There was no way to recover or delete all of it. It was out there permanently, beyond any control or remedy. I sold that house within 4 months of discovering the cameras. I couldn't live somewhere that had been so thoroughly surveilled, where strangers had watched me sleep and shower and exist in moments I'd believed were completely private. Every room felt contaminated by the knowledge of what had happened there, what had been recorded and sold and viewed by people whose names I'd never know. My new house was built recently enough that it doesn't need much maintenance, which is fortunate because I'll never hire another tradesperson to work unsupervised in my home. I've learned to do basic repairs myself, and for anything beyond my capabilities, I take time off work to be present whilst the work is done. I visually inspect every smoke detector, every vent, every light fixture regularly, checking for anything that seems out of place. But I know the footage still exists somewhere. Months of my life recorded without my knowledge or consent, available to people who paid for the privilege of watching a stranger in her own home. Every private moment I had during that period is potentially being viewed by someone right now, shared in spaces I'll never access, discussed by people I'll never identify. What disturbs me most is thinking about how many other people are living in homes with hidden cameras they don't know about. How many tradespeople are operating similar schemes right now, installing surveillance equipment during legitimate repair visits, selling access to private lives through dark web marketplaces. Steve was caught because I noticed he'd entered my house and installed obvious security cameras. But if I'd never noticed the initial intrusions, if I'd never installed those cameras, he'd still be operating. The surveillance would have continued indefinitely, and I'd never have known my home wasn't actually private. I gave a tradesperson a key once, a simple convenience to avoid scheduling conflicts done with someone I trusted based on years of apparently professional service. That decision led to months of secret surveillance. My private life sold to strangers as entertainment. Permanent footage existing in collections I'll never locate or control. That's what I think about now when I see repair vans in residential areas. Not whether the tradesperson is qualified or professional, but whether they're installing more than they're fixing. Whether they're creating opportunities for surveillance whilst homeowners trust them to work alone. Whether the homes they visited are being watched right now by paying subscribers who view private lives as commodities worth purchasing access to. I know how this is going to sound, but I need to talk about what happened. I used to think babysitting was about as safe as jobs get. You watch some kids, make sure they don't hurt themselves, maybe help with homework. Worst case scenario, someone's sick on your shoes or refuses to go to bed. I had no idea that looking after children could put you right in the middle of something genuinely horrifying. The opportunity came through a local mothers group in Hull, where I'd been volunteering after moving back home to help care for my elderly father. I'd worked in various childcare roles before relocating from London, and several women in the group had mentioned that they knew families who needed experienced babysitters for occasional evening work. One mother, Helen, said she could put me in touch with an agency that specialized in placing qualified childminders with families who required particularly reliable and discreet childcare. These families often had demanding careers that required unusual scheduling, and they were prepared to pay premium rates for babysitters who could adapt to irregular hours and maintain absolute confidentiality about family circumstances. The agency interview was more thorough than I'd expected for babysitting work. They conducted detailed background checks, requested references from previous childcare positions, and asked extensive questions about my experience with children of different ages and temperaments. They seemed particularly interested in my ability to remain calm under pressure and my willingness to follow specific instructions without questioning parental decisions. The agency manager explained that their client families often dealt with sensitive professional situations that required careful protection of their privacy. Children from these families were sometimes targeted by people seeking to exploit their parents' business relationships, which meant that babysitters needed to be particularly aware of security considerations. I was assigned to work with a family called the Weatherbys, who lived in a substantial house in one of Hull's more affluent areas. They had 2 children, aged 7 and 9, who were described as well-behaved and easy to manage. The parents traveled frequently for business and needed reliable evening childcare approximately twice per week. My first few babysitting sessions with the Weatherby children were exactly as advertised. The children were polite and cooperative, following established routines for dinner, homework, and bedtime without any difficulties. The house was comfortable and well-equipped, and the parents provided clear instructions for managing the children's schedules. However, I began noticing aspects of the household that seemed unusual for a typical family situation. The house contained security equipment that seemed excessive for residential use, including multiple cameras, motion sensors, and communication devices that suggested professional-grade surveillance systems. The children's behavior also seemed somewhat unusual, though not in ways that suggested mistreatment. They were extremely well trained in following security protocols, such as not answering the door under any circumstances and immediately reporting any unusual sounds or activities around the house. When I asked the children about these security measures, they explained matter-of-factly that their parents worked in industries that required careful protection of family privacy. They had been taught that discussing family activities with outsiders could create safety problems for everyone in the household. This seemed like reasonable precautions for families dealing with corporate espionage or competitive business pressures. Wealthy families often took security measures that would seem excessive to people from more ordinary circumstances, particularly when their business activities involve sensitive information. Around the 4th week of babysitting for the Weatherbys, I was asked to help with additional responsibilities that went beyond typical childcare duties. The agency explained that the family needed assistance with organizing household records and maintaining communication with various business contacts while the parents were traveling. These additional tasks involved managing correspondence, organizing files, and maintaining schedules for activities that seemed unrelated to typical family business. I was handling communications about meetings, transactions, and relationships that appeared to involve people from many different countries and business sectors. Some of the correspondence I was managing contained references to activities and arrangements that seemed inappropriate for legitimate business transactions. Discussions about transportation logistics, accommodation arrangements, and payment methods that suggested the family was coordinating activities that required significant secrecy and careful timing. When I expressed confusion about why childcare work involved managing such complex business correspondence, the agency explained that wealthy families often required household staff to provide comprehensive support that went beyond single-function roles. The boundaries between childcare, household management, and business assistance were often fluid in families with complex professional responsibilities. This seemed like a plausible explanation for legitimate work that happened to involve unusual responsibilities. Wealthy families did often expect household staff to handle various aspects of family and business management, particularly when travel schedules made it difficult for parents to manage everything directly. However, the specific nature of the business correspondence I was managing became increasingly concerning. Many of the communications involved coordinating meetings between the parents and people who were described in ways that suggested they were not typical business associates. References to ages, physical descriptions, and personal circumstances that seemed more relevant to personal relationships than business transactions appeared frequently in the correspondence I was organizing. The meetings being arranged often took place at unusual times and locations that seemed inappropriate for legitimate business activities. Around the 6th week of my work with the family, I discovered that some of the people being discussed in the business correspondence were individuals who had been reported missing in various parts of the country. The descriptions and personal details matched missing person reports that I recognized from local news coverage. The realization that I might be helping to coordinate activities involving missing people was deeply disturbing. The family's business activities appeared to involve people who had disappeared from their normal lives and were being moved through some kind of organized system. When I tried to discuss these concerns with the agency, they reminded me of the comprehensive confidentiality agreements I had signed when beginning work with the family. They emphasized that the business activities I was observing were complex legal matters that required careful protection from public scrutiny. They also pointed out that I had been managing sensitive correspondence and family information for several weeks, which meant that I had detailed knowledge of activities that could be misunderstood if taken out of context. My continued employment depended on maintaining absolute discretion about everything I had observed. The agency began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that they could not have gathered through our employment relationship. They made references to my father's health condition, my financial situation, and my living arrangements that suggested they had been conducting background research into my personal vulnerabilities. This surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my activities and communications were being monitored. The family and agency were apparently applying comprehensive intelligence gathering techniques to ensure my continued cooperation with activities I was beginning to understand were criminal. I realized that the babysitting work had been used to recruit me into participation in what appeared to be human trafficking operations. The children I was caring for were probably being used as props to create the appearance of normal family life, while their parents coordinated the movement and exploitation of vulnerable people. The correspondence I had been managing was likely coordination between traffickers rather than legitimate business communications. The security measures in the house were designed to prevent interference with criminal activities rather than protecting family privacy from business competitors. The missing people referenced in the correspondence were probably victims being moved through trafficking networks, and I had been unknowingly helping to coordinate their transportation and exploitation by managing communications between the people responsible for their disappearances. When I attempted to withdraw from the arrangement entirely, the agency pointed out that I had detailed knowledge of trafficking operations and could identify people involved in serious criminal activities. They suggested that my safety depended on continued cooperation rather than attempting to expose activities that involved dangerous people. The surveillance of my personal activities intensified after I tried to end my involvement with the family. The agency began sending me detailed information about my daily routine and my father's circumstances to demonstrate that they could threaten the safety of people I cared about if I caused problems for their operations. I tried reporting my suspicions to the police, but discovered that proving trafficking activities based on business correspondence and security measures was extremely difficult. The babysitting work had been presented as legitimate childcare. The household management tasks could be justified as normal responsibilities for wealthy families, and the correspondence could be explained as complex but legal business activities. The agency continued to contact me for several months after I stopped working for the family, offering additional childcare opportunities and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active. I never determined the full scope of the trafficking operation or what happened to the people whose movements I had been unknowingly coordinating. The combination of legitimate family appearances, sophisticated security measures, and systematic coordination suggested an organization capable of moving people across significant distances while maintaining the appearance of normal business activities. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for recruiting unwitting accomplices to trafficking operations by presenting criminal coordination as legitimate household management work. They understood how to exploit people's need for income and their natural trust in childcare situations to recruit participants in activities they would never willingly support. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire to provide good childcare had been transformed into participation in the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. The babysitting work had been a recruitment method designed to identify people who could be trusted with sensitive information and manipulated into maintaining silence about criminal activities. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar childcare agencies, offering well-paid positions with families who require particularly reliable and discreet babysitters. The positions they advertise always involve wealthy families with complex professional responsibilities, always require extensive confidentiality agreements, and always include household management duties that go beyond typical childcare work. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other childcare workers have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate family support while actually participating in criminal operations that exploit the most vulnerable people in society. I've always been someone who says yes to small favors without thinking too hard about it. Not because I'm particularly generous, more that it's easier than making excuses. If someone asks for something that won't cost me much time or effort, I'll generally just do it. That tendency has worked out fine over the years, helping friends move, looking after pets, providing references, normal, helpful acts that most people do without incident. I work as a speech and language therapist in Wolverhampton, mostly with children who have communication difficulties. I've been doing it for about 9 years now, working through a clinic that serves several schools in the area. I live alone, in a small terrace house. Nothing remarkable, the sort of settled but unexciting life that probably describes plenty of people my age. I'd never thought of my willingness to help as a vulnerability. Just a normal part of being reasonably decent. About a year ago, I was contacted by someone claiming to represent a parents' advocacy organization. They'd found my details through the clinic where I work and wanted to ask if I'd be willing to provide a brief testimonial about the importance of early intervention for children with speech delays. They were putting together a campaign to raise awareness and secure better funding for therapy services. And they wanted to include perspectives from professionals working directly with affected families. The request came via email and seemed legitimate enough. The organization's name was something generic but plausible: Parents United for Communication Support, or something similar. The email was professionally written, explained their goals clearly, and the request itself seemed entirely reasonable. They wanted a short video testimonial, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, where I'd talk about the impact that proper therapy can have on children's development and why adequate funding matters. I'm generally skeptical of unsolicited requests, but this one felt appropriate to my role. Advocacy for better therapeutic services is something I genuinely believe in, and the request wasn't asking for anything that seemed problematic. Just my professional opinion about work I do anyway, recorded in a format that could be shared with policymakers or included in awareness campaigns. The sort of thing that many professionals in my field have done at some point. I responded saying I'd be happy to provide a testimonial, and they sent back detailed instructions about what to include and how to record it. They wanted me to speak naturally about my work, mention specific challenges I'd seen families face due to inadequate access to services, and emphasize the difference that early intervention can make. They suggested I record it in my home rather than at the clinic, to make it feel more personal and less formally clinical. The instructions specified that I should introduce myself with my full name and professional role, so viewers would understand my credentials. They wanted me to mention where I worked and how long I'd been practicing, again for credibility. They suggested filming in a comfortable setting, maybe in my living room or somewhere that felt relaxed rather than office-like. The goal was to come across as authentic and personally invested, rather than reading from a script in a professional environment. I spent an evening recording the testimonial according to their guidelines. It took a few attempts to get something I was happy with. Speaking naturally to a camera feels more awkward than you'd expect, and I wanted to sound professional but not overly rehearsed. I talked about working with children who struggle to communicate, the frustration families experience when they can't access adequate support, and the transformative impact that proper therapy can have when it's available early enough. In the final version, I introduced myself by name, mentioned I'd been a speech and language therapist for 9 years, stated where I worked, and spoke for about 3 minutes about the importance of early intervention and proper funding. I filmed it in my living room, as suggested, trying to create the warm personal atmosphere they'd requested. I thought it came across as genuine and professionally credible, the sort of testimonial that might actually be useful for an advocacy campaign. I uploaded the video through a link they'd provided and received a thank you email shortly afterward. They said the testimonial was exactly what they needed and would be included in materials they were preparing for distribution to policymakers and funding bodies. They mentioned my contribution would help make a real difference in securing better services for children like those I worked with. It felt good, honestly. A small effort that might contribute to something meaningful. I didn't think about the testimonial again for several months. It had been a minor thing, an evening's work that I'd done, because it aligned with my professional values, and because saying no would have required more energy than simply doing what they'd asked. The organization never contacted me again, which seemed fine. Presumably, they'd used the testimonial in whatever campaign they'd been planning and moved on. Then, about 6 months after I'd recorded it, a colleague mentioned she'd seen something online that looked like me, but in a context she found confusing. She'd been searching for information about therapeutic services and stumbled across a video featuring someone who looked exactly like me, speaking in my voice, but saying things that didn't quite match what she knew about my work or views. She thought perhaps I'd done an interview she wasn't aware of, but some of the content seemed odd. When she described what she'd seen, I didn't immediately connect it to the testimonial I'd recorded, but something about her description made me uneasy. So I asked her to send me the link if she came across it again. She found it that same afternoon and forwarded it to me with a message saying she'd definitely been right that it was strange. The video she'd found was professionally edited and appeared to be a promotional advertisement for private speech therapy services. It featured footage of me, clearly taken from the testimonial I'd recorded, but edited in ways that completely changed the context and meaning of what I'd said. Individual sentences had been extracted and rearranged, paired with text and imagery that made it seem like I was endorsing a specific private practice and criticizing NHS services. The editing was sophisticated enough that the transitions felt natural if you weren't paying close attention. My voice remained consistent, the visual cuts were smooth, and the overall presentation made it seem like I'd intentionally recorded an endorsement for these private services. Someone watching casually would have no reason to suspect it wasn't genuine, particularly since I'd introduced myself by name and professional credentials exactly as the original instructions had specified. I was immediately angry and disturbed by this misuse of footage I'd provided in good faith. I contacted the parents' advocacy organization using the email address they'd originally reached out from, demanding they remove the edited video and explain how my testimonial had ended up being used for commercial purposes. The email bounced back as undeliverable. I tried searching for the organization online and found nothing. No website, no social media presence, no record of their existence beyond the emails they'd sent me. I reported the misuse to the private practice that appeared to be benefiting from the promotional video. They claimed they'd commissioned the video from a marketing company and had no knowledge that the testimonial wasn't genuine. They removed it from their website, but said they'd pay good money for professional promotional content and were as much victims of deception as I was. That should have been the end of it, an unpleasant experience of being deceived and having my professional credibility misused, but resolved once the immediate misuse was addressed. Except a few weeks later, my colleague found another video featuring the same footage of me, this time edited differently and appearing on a completely unrelated website advertising therapeutic services in a different region. Over the following months, my testimonial footage appeared in dozens of different contexts, sometimes promoting private therapy services, sometimes in advertisements for educational products, occasionally in materials for organizations whose purposes I couldn't even identify. Each time the editing was different, my words rearranged and recontextualized to serve whatever purpose the current user needed. My face and voice, speaking with apparent professional authority, endorsing things I'd never heard of and didn't support. I reported each instance I discovered, but they appeared faster than I could track them. The testimonial footage had clearly been sold or distributed to multiple parties who were using it for various commercial purposes. My introduction, stating my name, professional role, workplace, and credentials, made the footage particularly valuable because viewers would perceive me as a credible authority endorsing whatever product or service was being advertised. Then I received a message from someone claiming they'd found my testimonial footage for sale on the dark web. They were a journalist investigating deceptive marketing practices and had discovered a marketplace where professional testimonial footage was being sold to businesses wanting to create credible-seeming endorsements without actually hiring genuine professionals or seeking authentic testimonials. She showed me the listing where my footage was available. It was on a marketplace organized like a professional stock footage library, with categories for different professions and types of testimonials. My footage was listed under healthcare professionals, described as a genuine speech therapist, providing credible endorsement content that could be edited for various purposes. The listing included the raw footage I'd originally recorded, allowing buyers to edit it however they wanted for their specific needs. It emphasized my credentials and authentic presentation, marketing the footage as valuable specifically because I'd introduced myself with real details that made edited versions appear legitimate. The price was substantial, around several £100s for unlimited editing rights, marketed as a bargain compared to hiring an actual professional to record testimonials. The purchase history showed my footage had been bought by over 40 different accounts. 40 separate buyers had paid for the right to edit my testimonial into whatever promotional content suited their purposes. Each one could create unlimited variations, rearranging my words and pairing them with whatever imagery or text advanced their commercial interests. The journalist explained that this type of testimonial farming was increasingly common. Scammers would create fake organizations or causes that sounded legitimate, request testimonials from professionals who wanted to support apparently worthy purposes, then sell the resulting footage on dark web marketplaces to businesses engaged in deceptive advertising. The professionals who'd recorded testimonials rarely discovered the misuse, and when they did, the distributed nature of the content made it nearly impossible to fully address. She'd been investigating after several other professionals contacted her about similar experiences. Speech therapists, medical professionals, educators, anyone whose credentials made them valuable endorsers for products or services. All of them had been deceived into recording testimonials for fake organizations, only to have their footage sold and misused extensively. I contacted a solicitor about potential legal action, but the situation was complicated by the distributed nature of the misuse and the difficulty of identifying who was actually responsible. The fake organization that had requested my testimonial didn't exist in any traceable form. The buyers on the dark web marketplace were anonymous. The individual businesses using edited versions of my testimonial could claim they'd purchased what they believed was legitimate promotional content and weren't responsible for the deceptive acquisition. The journalist published an article about testimonial farming that included my story alongside several others. The publicity led to some of the more prominent misuses being removed, but I knew the footage itself still existed in the collections of people who downloaded it before marketplaces were shut down or moved to new locations. My testimonial could still appear in new contexts indefinitely, edited in ways I'd never see and used for purposes I'd never approve of. What made it particularly violating was understanding how the deception had worked. They'd specifically requested I film at home to make it feel personal and authentic, which also meant the footage showed details of my living space. They'd asked me to introduce myself with my full name and credentials to establish credibility, which made edited versions seem authoritative. They'd suggested I speak naturally about my work, which provided hours of raw footage that could be chopped up and rearranged into almost any message they wanted to create. I'd willingly provided everything they needed to create convincing false endorsements of products and services I knew nothing about. My desire to help what I believed was a worthy cause, my tendency to say yes to reasonable-sounding requests, had been deliberately exploited to turn me into an unknowing spokesperson for commercial interests I'd never chosen to support. The psychological impact went beyond just anger at being deceived. Every time I introduce myself professionally now, every time I speak about my work, I wonder if someone might recognize me from one of the edited testimonials and assume I actually endorse whatever product or service they'd seen me appearing to promote. My professional credibility, which I'd spent years building, had been weaponized without my consent and used in ways that could potentially damage the reputation I depended on. I also think about the 40 unknown buyers who purchased my testimonial footage. Who were they? What products or services did they use my image to promote? How many people saw versions of me endorsing things I'd never heard of, believing I genuinely recorded those testimonials? The journalist's investigation suggested the testimonial farming operation had collected footage from over 200 professionals before being exposed, meaning thousands of deceptive advertisements had been created using stolen credibility. The organization that had originally contacted me was never identified or prosecuted. The marketplace where my footage was sold was shut down, but apparently resurfaced elsewhere shortly afterward. The individual buyers who'd purchased my testimonial remained anonymous, protected by the architecture of dark web transactions that made tracing specific users nearly impossible, without extensive resources and cooperation that rarely materialize it. I'm much more careful now. I question motivations more thoroughly, research organizations more extensively before agreeing to participate in anything. But I also know the damage is already done. My testimonial footage exists in collections I'll never access, potentially still being edited into new promotional content. My face and voice continuing to endorse things I've never agreed to support. That's what I think about now when I see professional testimonials in advertisements. Not whether the person genuinely believes what they're saying, but whether they actually said it at all, whether their footage was stolen through deceptive requests and edited to serve purposes they'd never approved, whether that credible-seeming healthcare professional or educator actually recorded that endorsement, or whether someone like me was tricked into providing raw material that was later manipulated into whatever message served commercial interests. I tried to help what I believed was a worthy cause by recording a simple testimonial about work I genuinely cared about. That willingness to help was systematically exploited to turn me into an unknowing spokesperson for dozens of products and services I'd never endorsed. My professional credibility became a commodity sold to the highest bidders, my face and voice repurposed endlessly for commercial gains I'd never share in, and purposes I'd never chosen. The testimonial footage exists. Somewhere online, my edited image continues appearing in contexts I'll never see, endorsing things I'd never support, speaking words I never said to serve interests I'd never approve of. That's the lasting price of one evening spent trying to help. One small favor that seemed entirely reasonable at the time, but turned out to be exactly the vulnerability someone was looking for. I have put off saying this because it makes me look careless, and because it makes people lean in as if they enjoy hearing it, which does something unpleasant to the back of my neck. I am saying it now because the shape of it has been stuck to everything I do, and pretending otherwise has not made it loosen. It started with a second-hand laptop I bought off a bloke in a supermarket car park on a drizzly afternoon, the sort of errand you wedge between buying bin liners and grabbing a reduced rotisserie chicken. I told myself it was a bargain, and I told myself I would wipe it clean as soon as I got home. I told myself a lot of things. What I did first was open the lid and have a look. My flat sits on the top floor of a tired building that looks better in rain than in sun. The hallway smells faintly of damp paint and someone's fabric softener. Inside it's just me, a sofa that never quite stopped smelling like the delivery van, a TV I bought on credit, a kitchen I keep reasonably neat, and a door that sticks in humid weather. Ordinary. The sort of place where a laptop on the coffee table looks like a sensible plan rather than a risk. The machine booted up quickly. Someone had put effort into it. There were 2 user accounts. The obvious one had a child's name and a picture of a cartoon cat. The other had a short, forgettable word and a blank icon. I clicked the cartoon cat because I assumed I would find photos to delete and documents to drag to the bin. There were holiday snaps that looked like Devon based on the sea and the color of the sand. There were school letters and a budget spreadsheet that made me feel intrusive and then guilty. I dragged them all to the recycle bin, emptied it, and sat for a moment feeling like I'd done something respectful. I should have left it there. I should have wiped the thing properly and reinstalled a fresh copy of everything. Instead, I clicked the plain account because it was there and because curiosity is just a polite word for ignoring your better judgment. No password. The desktop was absolutely bare apart from a single folder with a name so unremarkable it might as well have been invisible. Inside that were a handful of files with names that meant nothing unless you'd seen them before. They ended in a way that told me they were shortcut files. I understood enough to recognize where they pointed. Hidden pages. The sort people pretend are urban myths until they have a quiet evening and a drink and decide to find out for themselves. I had never gone looking for that part of the internet because it always seemed like a shortcut to either boredom or trouble. A lot of it, I had heard, was dead links and rumors. But there was something about the neatness of those shortcuts and the fact that they were sitting on a machine I now owned. I told myself I would click one, see nothing, and shut it down. That felt almost like maintenance. It felt like finishing someone else's sentence tidily. The first link didn't load. The second did. It opened to a page with a dead simple layout, like someone had copied a cheap classified site and turned the background dark for atmosphere. Titles, tiny thumbnails, location tags that used towns and counties I recognized. Not America, not somewhere far away. The sort of places I had driven through in the rain on the way to see a friend. Most of the titles were mundane in a way that made them worse. Live view of back garden, street door, flat kitchens. The thumbnails were the size of fingernails. In all of them, the light fell the way light falls in real houses where people try their best. A plant on a sill, a pile of post, a dog bed. I clicked one at random and saw the inside of a hallway with cheap laminate and a shoe rack, the sort that topples if you rush it. The view did not move unless the house moved, and every now and again someone walked past, never looking at the place the camera must have been. It made my mouth taste metallic. I clicked another. A kitchen with a pattern of tiles I have seen in 100 rentals. An oven with the brand lightly rubbed off. A kettle left too close to the edge. Nothing dramatic, just the ache of being allowed to look where I shouldn't. I told myself it was a one-off curiosity. I told myself I would shut it down. I clicked another. The third window opened to the inside of a landing with a familiar grey carpet and a thin radiator. There was a door with a hairline crack in the paint near the handle, the kind that appears when a landlord does a quick job and calls it done. The camera was angled low as if jammed into the top corner, and I felt a rush of something sour because I recognized the scuff on the skirting board. It looked too much like mine. It wasn't my landing. Not exactly. The light fitting was slightly different, and the radiator had a dent mine doesn't. But the proportions were right, and the space had that same tightness that makes you turn your shoulders when you walk through with a bag. I told myself it was the same developer, the same cut and paste layout, replicated across different towns. I told myself to stop being dramatic. Then I clicked back to the list and saw a title I had missed because the thumbnail was too dark. The title was a street name I knew well. My street. The bit in brackets after it had my building's letter. I clicked and saw the inside of my stairwell. The camera had been fixed somewhere up near the emergency light. The lens was wide enough to catch the top of the stairs, the fire door, and the grubby patch where people rest their hands when they squeeze past someone else. I stared until my own expression looked unfamiliar reflected in the screen. The timestamp in the corner rolled forward, and in the middle of the frame something shifted. The fire door eased open and a shoe appeared, then a leg. Me carrying a bag with a loaf of bread sticking out because I never remembered to bring a proper carrier. I watched myself fumble the fob, shoulder the door, and disappear. There is no way to describe the feeling of seeing your own back in a place you thought was private. It is like having your name shouted in a crowded room in a tone that makes you want to apologize without knowing why. I shut the lid and sat very still. The room hummed with the sound of the fridge and the building's old pipework. I stood, walked to my door, opened it, and stared at the same stairwell. The same emergency light that buzzed now, I had noticed it. I looked up into the corners. Nothing obvious. I went back inside, locked the door, and looked around the flat in a way that made everything feel temporary, like a set put up for a rehearsal. Then I did what I should have done at the start. I wiped the laptop. Full reset. I told myself that was the end. It wasn't. The next morning, something small had changed. The cheap rubber wedge I used to stop the door slamming in a draft was not at the angle I always left it. It pointed inward instead of out. It could have been nothing. I left for work and tried to put it away, like you put away a bad dream by telling someone you slept fine. When I came home, the post that had been pushed through the letterbox lay in a fan pattern that didn't match the way it usually scattered. One envelope sat neatly on top. It was blank. Inside was a pay-as-you-go phone, the kind you can buy in the corner of any shop that sells fizzy drinks and scratch cards. The battery was in, but the screen was black. I pressed the button, and it woke to show a handful of missed notifications. I put it down like it was warm from someone else's pocket. I don't know at what point something stops being coincidence and starts being arranged. I picked up the laptop to feel like I was doing something active, like handling the problem with my hands might make it softer. There is a moment in all this where I keep wanting to say I should have gone to the police. I did, later. At this point, I was still hovering on the edge of convincing myself I was being dramatic. The reset had done its job as far as the machine knew. Fresh, empty, no shortcuts, no list. The cheap phone buzzed on the table. It lit with a notification in a style that looked like any other. There were no names and no emojis because there didn't need to be. I will not repeat the exact words. There were instructions without threats, which made the threat louder. There was a link that did not require any special software. I used the laptop because it already felt like the contaminated object in the room. The page that loaded was not complicated. It was a single column layout, dark background, white text, no logo. At the top, my street and building, then my door number. Below that, a live window with a view of my living room from somewhere up near the ceiling. It captured the sofa, the coffee table, the edge of the TV, and the corner where the light from the kitchen fell into the room. I stood and went to the middle of the carpet and raised a hand. On the screen, a hand lifted with that tiny delay that makes you feel like you are nodding at a stranger through a window. I looked up at my own ceiling, and my eyes struggled to stick to any one point, because now every tiny dot was a possibility. I should have run out into the hallway and shouted. I should have called out to neighbors I barely know. Instead, I moved slowly, which felt less like softness and more like not falling over. I checked behind books, inside vases, along the curtain rail. Nothing. I went into the kitchen and looked into cupboards as if a camera might sit in with the cereal. Back in the living room, I squinted into the shadow line where the wall meets the ceiling. There was a smudge so faint, I would never have noticed it on a normal day. I climbed onto a chair and reached up. My fingers brushed a small plastic dome, the size of a drawing pin head, fixed into the plaster and painted over. There was the thinnest seam around it, like the ring left by a glass. I didn't try to dig it out. I didn't want to know whether it would crumble the plaster or come away clean. The phone buzzed again on the table. The page scrolled down as if to meet me halfway. Under the live window were tiles I didn't touch at first. The headers were plain: routine, sleep, kitchen, bathroom. There was a counter that had already been counting before I arrived. There were short clips that someone had carved out of my weeks without my permission. Me making tea, me brushing my teeth, me sleeping under a thin duvet with my mouth open because my nose blocks when the heating dries the air. There were no comments. There was a tally that meant something to someone, not to me. There were pastes of my outside life as well. Me carrying bags up the stairs. Me locking the door. Me talking to a delivery driver with my hands, because I do that more than I think. The page used 2 words I hated immediately: scheduled and options. I shut the laptop and breathed in through my mouth until I had a grip on the shape of it. I took the cheap phone into the bathroom, ran the tap, and held the phone under it until the sound turned dull and the screen died. It made me feel like I had done something, which lasted for about a minute. Then I took the chair back to where I had found the plastic dot and pressed until the wood creaked under me, and I could get my nail under the edge of the thing. It did not crumble. It popped out with a sound like a small knuckle. There was a drilled hole behind it, with a tiny pocket of darkness. I pressed tissue into the hole and taped over it. The tissue swelled a bit with damp because the plaster was cold. I wanted to be sick. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next morning, I rang the police on the non-emergency line because the idea of explaining it without proof made me feel like I was making a fuss. The person I spoke to was kind in a way that felt like a hand on the shoulder you don't quite want. They suggested logging everything and keeping the broken device. They suggested talking to my building manager. They suggested stronger logs, better lighting, and a camera of my own. I thanked them because that's what I do when I don't know what else to do. I went to a locksmith and had the cylinder replaced. I bought a motion detector that emails you. I set it up and felt briefly competent until I remembered what I'd been looking at the day before. In the evening, I went out for bread and milk, even though I didn't need either. When I came back, the new lock turned with a satisfying click. On the mat, a small padded envelope waited with my name and the right door number in letters cut from a newspaper. It felt like a cliché until I picked it up and felt the shape of what was inside. Not a phone this time, a key. I knew the weight before I unsealed it. The old lock cylinder. My fingers went cold around it in a way a radiator can't fix. There is a point where fear becomes a practical project. I went through the flat room by room. I found another small dome above the bathroom door, painted neatly, as if someone had a spirit level. I found a thin slit in the top of the skirting behind the sofa, where perhaps a cable had been run and pulled back. Under the sink, there was a patch of cleaner paint the size of a fist. I checked the tiny cupboard that holds the stopcock and found a piece of tape with a tiny rectangle of glass stuck to it, glued inside where you would only see it if you were looking for a leak. Each discovery felt like it shrank the size of the place, as if the walls were moving in by the width of a brick with each thing I found. I stayed at a budget hotel that night, paying in cash at the desk, even though it felt performative. The corridor smelled like carpet cleaner and hot dust. I ate a sandwich on the bed and watched an ordinary program, because I needed an ordinary voice in the room. When I went to brush my teeth, there was a folded slip of paper on the edge of the basin. I had not seen it when I came in. It wasn't there when I put my bag down. It had no writing on it, just the impression of something that had been pressed hard and lifted away, like the ghost of letters. I held it under the light. The raised marks looked like the edges of a street name. Mine. When I went down to the desk to ask a question without asking, the person on duty smiled in a way that said they had been trained to handle the night. I slept badly and dreamt of corridors. The next day, my email pinged on my main phone at work. I had set the new motion detector to email me if it sensed anything. The subject lines arrived in a steady line, one after the other, each a stamped time. Movement detected, movement detected, movement detected. I did not open them at my desk. I took an early lunch and walked without tasting the air. In the doorway of my building, I paused because pausing felt like keeping a promise to the version of me that had not bought the laptop. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The flat smelled like crumpled plastic. On the kitchen table sat a plastic tub like the ones used for takeaway sauces. Inside it was a smear of something that once had color. Next to it lay a single glove, the kind used for food preparation. Under the glove was a photo on cheap paper. I was in it, sitting where I was now standing. The angle was from high up. The date in the corner was yesterday. In that version of the room, my mouth was slightly open. My eyes were not on anything. Behind me, in the doorway, a shape blurred as if the camera had moved. The caption underneath was not words, which somehow made it worse. It was a row of symbols like the ones used to rate films, except there were no stars, just circles and the shadow of a pound sign. I did not eat that night. I behaved like a person having an ordinary week. I took my laundry to the basket. I washed the mug with more care than the mug deserved. I watched the news with the sound low. At 2 a.m, my phone vibrated on the bedside table with the weight of a message I knew I would read. The subject line was the name of my street. The sender was nothing. The body was just a link and a short line of text that implied a schedule. I opened it because I am the kind of person who picks at a scab. The page that loaded was not the same as the first. This one was less tidy, as if whoever made it had been hurried or was copying someone else's work. At the top, a small window already playing. The camera looked down on a basement car park I recognized by the oil stain that looks like Britain. The lens shifted slightly as if adjusted. The feed cut. Another window opened to show the end of my road. The lamppost at the corner flickered the way it always does. The view shook once as someone moved past the camera. The feed cut. A final window opened to show my bedroom, as if the ceiling were made of glass. The duvet rose and fell slightly. The timestamp was in the corner. There was a visible heartbeat in the way the fabric moved. Below the live windows, blocks of text waited like items on a takeaway menu. I will not put the words here. They were suggestions, tasks, things to do to me. Some of them read like petty pranks. Some did not. Each had a value in pounds next to it, and a longer number in smaller print. The total at the bottom turned over slowly. There was no place to type. The page was not addressed to me. It was addressed to the sort of person who enjoys the feeling of rails under their feet when a train is just behind them. I closed the page and stood up too quickly, which put stars at the edge of my vision. The room tilted hard enough to make the wall look like it was thinking about letting me through. I dressed badly and left without turning anything off. The hallway felt squeezed. In the stairwell, the emergency light buzzed more loudly than it had the day before. Outside, the cold woke a slice of my brain that had been lying face down. I walked until my legs were bored and my head quietened to a functional hum. In the following days, small things rearranged themselves. My doormat turned completely around. A glass that I keep upside down over the bathroom tap to stop dust had a fingerprint on the inside. The bin had been emptied to the point where the liner sat flat at the bottom. I started staying out late and coming home suddenly, like I could catch someone in the act of not being there. The motion detector emails kept coming in clumps. The page updated whether I looked or not. I stopped looking for almost a week. When I finally did, it was because I had a calm hour on a Sunday afternoon and the quietness felt brittle. The page had changed again. There was a new section with a label that suggested things had progressed. The live window showed my kitchen. Steam fogged briefly near the hob. Then the view cut to show my front door from the inside, as if the viewer wanted me to be perfectly clear about the direction of travel. The suggestions below were shorter now. The values had crept up. The total at the bottom had doubled since the last time I watched. I scrolled down and found a new heading with a mocked-up certificate under it. It had my address and a phrase that implied the word featured. Underneath, a paragraph in plain English invited people to support the next stage if they were enjoying the show. I went to the police with a printout because something about paper makes people behave differently. I spoke with someone who had seen too much of this sort of bluntness to pretend to be shocked. They took details. They asked sensible questions. They gave advice that was ordinary in good ways. Speak to the building manager properly. Get the free security survey. Consider staying with someone. They said the words in the calm voice that people use to hold heavy things without dropping them. I left with a crime reference number and a leaflet about online safety that used a cheerful font. In the foyer of my building, one of the post boxes was hanging open with its lock broken. Inside was a stack of charity appeals and a parcel card for someone else. On the floor lay a tiny screw, the sort you need a special driver for. I picked it up and held it in my glove like it would explain itself if I squeezed hard enough. Back upstairs, my door stuck in the same place it always sticks when the weather turns. The mat was exactly aligned with the floorboards. The keys on the hook were a fraction out of place. That night I slept with my shoes on. It sounds dramatic written down. It felt practical in the moment, like filling the kettle before bed in case the water stops. At some time after 3, the room changed shape. It is hard to describe this without sounding like I am adding flourishes to make the story satisfying. The temperature didn't drop in a sudden swoop. The air didn't go quiet. None of that. I woke because of 2 things that happened close together. The first was the flat sound of my letterbox being lifted and let fall. The second was the sound of my front door finding its frame and pressing. The lock held. The handle moved. Someone on the other side knew how to wake metal without breaking it. I lay very still and did the sort of breathing you do when you are trying to be small. The handle eased back to neutral. The hush that followed had weight. Then the careful sound of a thin tool worked into a place it didn't belong. I got up in the kind of slow motion you do when you distrust your own limbs. I moved to the side of the door, thinking of the cheap peephole view you get in older buildings, that warp where everything looks fishbowl far away. The motion detector sent me an email I didn't need. The phone screen lit the room briefly, and put white rectangles on the wall. The latch gave up its job in a way I felt in my toes. The door opened just enough to let nothing in. Then something narrow and patient slipped through near the floor. The toe of a shoe, a knee, a gloved hand. The figure that followed was not large. Another shape came close behind it. Both wore dark clothes that didn't try to make a statement. No masks that I could see, which made my mouth go dry. They smelled like something you buy at a builder's merchant. I had once thought about buying a baseball bat for this sort of situation. I had never played baseball, which is why I didn't. Instead, I had a heavy old spanner in the utility drawer that I never used because all my pipes are plastic. I held it in my right hand and put my left on the wall to stop the room moving. When the first person stood and reached to the inside of the frame for the chain I do not have, I moved without announcing myself. The spanner met a shoulder with a noise like someone hitting a wet sack with a plank. The person went sideways into the door, which rebounded and caught the second person's shin in a way that would make a bruise later. The second person reacted quickly, the way you do when you've hit your shin on the same thing before. A hand came up and something flashed in the low light. The heavy feeling that followed reached me before the pain. My forearm went numb and my hand let go of the spanner as if it had never belonged to me. What happened next was fast and not. The first person recovered with the annoyed efficiency of someone keen not to waste the evening. The second moved into my space in a way that suggested this was not the first hallway of the night. I went down on one knee because my legs had decided to change roles without telling me. A hand took my wrist and turned it the wrong way until it found a position that made my eyes water. Something hard pressed into the soft part below my ear to remind me to stop trying things. In my head I had arguments and speeches. In the actual corridor I had breath. They did not say anything. That is important to me, even now. They moved me just enough to clear the space. They kept me in a position that made my arms feel like other people's. One of them walked the rooms quickly, not touching anything twice, lifting in places I hadn't known to check, leaving in places I cleaned most. The other stayed with me, calm and boring in the way good tradespeople are. At some point, a phone camera made the small digital sound I will never be able to enjoy again. I refused to look at it in the way of a child who knows the answer to a question they are not ready to say. In the kitchen, a drawer opened and closed with a quiet certainty that means someone practiced. The bathroom door clicked and clicked again. The bedroom received short, careful steps, and then one heavy thump as someone tested the wardrobe anchor. Back in the hallway, sticky tape peeled and pressed near the skirting. My doorbell made a sound I didn't recognize because I never used it. The flat recorded all of this in a dozen tiny places I had not found. The pain announced itself when they were nearly finished. I became aware of my forearm, like it had stepped closer in a queue. There was a patch of heat at my shoulder, where I had made contact with the spanner handle when it bounced. My knee had a wet feeling under my jeans, where it had met a screw head in the threshold. The air smelled of tape adhesive and the sort of rubber you get on cheap tool handles. They left me in the narrow bit by the boiler cupboard, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall. The front door stood open a fractional amount, as if the building were taking a breath. There was a smear of something dark on the inside edge about the size of a thumb. I watched it develop a skin at the edges. I did nothing for a length of time that had no number. When I finally stood, everything in me argued and then did as it was told. I moved through the rooms the way a person moves through a house they are thinking of buying, even though they can't afford it. I touched nothing the way you avoid touching hot glass that looks cool. The kitchen drawer that had been opened contained my knives, which were in exactly the same order I always put them back. The bathroom felt harmless, and then did not when I looked up and saw a new dot above the mirror, not painted, just neat. In the bedroom, my pillow had a shallow dent that matched the shape of my head too well. I stripped the bed then and there and put the sheets in a bin bag because it felt like the only thing in my power. On the coffee table, the heavy old spanner sat where it had fallen, its handle glossy with a smear that was not mine. Next to it, on the coaster I never use, lay a small rectangle of card. It was blank on one side. On the other, someone had pressed a shape into it without ink, just pressure. The shape was simple, a bell. Under it, the impression of a time that was not precise, just a range in the evening. When my doorbell rang that night at a time within the range, I did not move. It rang again the next evening, and I still did not. On the third evening, there was no bell. Instead, there was a light tapping at the kitchen window that sits over the flat roof where the bins are. I stood at the sink and listened to it. Count off my heartbeats. The tapping stopped, and something light slid off the sill. I checked the page again because I am human, and because you can look at something awful the way you look at a chipped tooth with your tongue. The live window showed nothing but stillness. The total at the bottom of the page had stopped. The last clip in the sequence was of me on the floor in the hallway, head turned away, shoulder high, where my arm had been arranged. Under it, a single line of text I will not replicate. It used the kind of tone people use when they are pretending to be polite in a shop. I moved a few weeks later, not dramatically. I gave notice, packed badly, and paid a man with a van who had opinions about the parking restrictions on my new street. The new place is smaller and higher up, with a view of rooftops that look like a bad drawing. I had new locks fitted the day I got the keys. I put foam in the gaps where you could run a wire. I stopped buying second-hand electronics. I bought a laptop from a shop where they ask you unnecessary questions and you answer them because you want to be the sort of person who answers questions. On the first night, I slept like a person who has spent a day lifting boxes. On the second night, I woke because a fox screamed outside, the sound of metal bending in a mouth. I lay there and told myself what it was, the shape of it, the place it came from. I almost believed myself. Sometimes, when I have a soft hour and my phone sits face down on the table and the light from the window breaks neatly across the floor, I feel a pull to check. Not because I want to see, but because not seeing feels like agreeing to something. I have resisted more often than I have not. The few times I failed, the page did not load. It timed out. It threw up an error in a box with a border. It suggested trying again later. It made me feel like I had winced in front of someone. I kept the card with the bell in a drawer I don't use for anything else. Some days I think about throwing it away. Some days I take it out and press my thumb over the raised shape until the skin shines. I do not watch the live windows anymore. I do not buy devices in car parks. I fix the wedge under my door in exactly the same way every night and check it in the morning to see if the room has breathed. Every now and again, a parcel turns up that I haven't ordered. It will be something ordinary like a set of vacuum bags or a pack of picture hooks I never meant to buy, delivered by a tired person who says nothing because I say nothing. I take them inside and put them in a cupboard in the new kitchen that I keep for things I cannot return. A drawer squeaks in a way it did not squeak last week. A screw on a switch plate looks too new. The radiator makes a click it doesn't make on cold mornings. I listen to everything the way you listen to a stranger tell a story about a place you've been. I know how this sounds. When I tell it this way, people ask why I didn't shout, why I didn't fight harder, why I didn't do the clean, heroic version. I don't have a neat ending to offer. There is no line where I stood up and frightened them off. There is no moment where I pulled out a hidden camera of my own and got the evidence in a way that satisfies the story. What I have is a stack of small moments, placed carefully, until they formed a slope I slid down without noticing the angle change. What I have is the memory of looking up at my own ceiling and meeting the stare down of a hole the width of a pencil. What I have is a bell pressed into card and a range in the evening I will always hear even when the building is quiet. If there is any use in saying it out loud, it is this. If you think your life is too ordinary to be interesting, that helps someone else more than it helps you. The pages don't need you to be special. They need you to be predictable. They need you to put your doormat down the same way every time and to go to the same shop for milk and to prop the door with a wedge when the weather turns. They need you to buy a bargain that saves you a little bit of money and a little bit of time, because there is always someone ready to spend both on your behalf. In my new place, the windows face a line of chimneys that put smoke into the sky on cold evenings. I can track the wind by watching which way it smears. The flat has its own noises, all of which I know now by heart. The kettle makes a click at the end of the boil that is almost a cough. The fridge hums in the early hours and then stops as if embarrassed. The plumbing knocks once in the bathroom at the same point in the shower every morning. I tell myself names for each sound so they feel like neighbors I have met rather than strangers on the stairs. Some nights I still sleep with my shoes on. Not often. Just enough to make getting to the door a little faster if the bell rings. I have not heard it in months. I hear it anyway. There are people who enjoy this, I think. Not in the cartoon way that's easy to dislike. In the small way, the way you enjoy making a bed neat or clicking a box on a list. People who like seeing a total rollover because they made it roll. People who like the idea of a person in a box doing what buttons tell them to do. I don't think about them much because thinking about them gives them more than they took. I think about the gaps you leave when you assume no one will use them. This is, I suppose, a confession. I am not someone who breaks rules because I want the thrill. I am not someone who goes looking for trouble. I bought a laptop in a car park because it was cheap, and because I thought I was cleverer than the sort of person who gets caught by small things. I was wrong. That is the part that sticks, not the tap on the window or the page with its sums. The part where I looked at my own stairwell on a screen in my own room and felt the world tilt because someone had been there and then stepped back without leaving anything you can hold in your hand. If you have read this far, you will have guessed the point without me having to make it heavy. Curiosity opens doors that are hard to shut quietly, and once a door has learned the shape of your hand, it does not forget. I suppose the obvious way to start is simply to say that I shouldn't have kept that chest of drawers. When I first came across it, it looked harmless enough. Beech veneer lifting at the corners. One loose handle, part of a house clearance lot from a terrace place off Abbeydale Road. I wanted my Sheffield flat to feel finished without spending much, so I carried it up in 2 awkward bursts, rested it on the landing to catch my breath, and slid it against the bedroom wall by the window. The scrape it left on the skirting didn't matter. The room felt more like a room with somewhere to put socks. I found the phone by accident while lining the drawers with old wrapping paper. My nail snagged tape glued under the lip, revealing a thin, cheap handset, the sort you buy at a supermarket when you've cracked your screen. On the back, under scuffed plastic, was a printed sticker with a web address and a short code. I didn't throw it away. When charged, it opened to a tidy page. No logos I recognized, just flat colors, a small icon like an open box, and a form asking me to confirm an item had changed hands. Fields for a short code and postcode. A button saying continue. I'd read enough pieces with dark web in the headlines to recognize what I was looking at, even if I'd never used it. It felt like scanning a warranty card. I typed the code, tapped my postcode, and pressed continue. The reply came old-fashioned, on paper. An envelope under the end bench in the little park by the shops. My first name in tidy block capitals. Inside was enough for a modest food shop and folded instructions thanking me for registering. A small bonus would be paid if I confirmed the chest was positioned safely. To the left of the bed, level with the window but away from the radiator to avoid warping. I had already put it there. It asked for 2 photos from 2 angles. I sent them. A minute later, the page displayed a small green tick and nothing else. After that came jobs dressed as care. Take a photo with curtains drawn and the bedside lamp on. Another with curtains open and ceiling light off. Measure the gap from bed to door using your foot as a rough unit. Count steps from the front entrance to your landing. Film a slow pan across the window from street to sky. Each was paid the same way. Envelopes at places so ordinary they were almost funny. Behind the grit bin, under the 3rd slab at the tram stop, inside a station locker with a code. Enough cash to feel like something for nothing. Never so much it felt like a bribe. The first wrong thing was almost polite. After a courier dropped bulbs and a kettle I'd ordered, another knock came. No one stood outside when I checked the viewer, but a postcard lay on the mat. One side showed a printed map of my street, with a dot where my building sits, and a thin pencil arc traced from my window to the car park's far corner. The other side, in the same tidy hand from the envelopes, thanked me for confirming a line of sight. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even rude. It simply suggested that what I had done was useful to someone else. I started behaving like a person who keeps their head down. I took the drawers out and checked for surprises in the seams. Nothing. I pressed the backboard, flimsy fiberboard held by staples. I listened for clicks that weren't there. When small cards slid under the door with fresh codes, I entered them and did what was asked. Confirm whether the corridor smoke alarm uses a plastic key or hex screw. Photograph the intercom panel from arm's length. Record 30 seconds of street view from inside the window at dusk. Each task looked like a survey. Surveys don't bite. A woman in the block opposite pinned a note asking if anyone had seen a van outside at odd hours. People scribbled that they hadn't. I had seen plenty and said nothing. Not writing felt like the decision that kept everything ordinary. One night the drawer made a sound like a trapped insect under glass, tiny and quick. I pressed my ear to the top, just laminate easing as the heating clicked off. I said that to myself twice, and it became true enough to sleep on. In the morning, a card sat on the mat with a new code and time window. When I opened the page, it didn't show a form. It showed my room, a fisheye view from up on the wall to the left of the window, not wide enough to be the ceiling, not low enough to be bedside level. My unmade bed. The drawer exactly where the instructions had told me to put it. Yesterday's shirt on the chair. A small counter ticked in the corner. Text told me to leave the room and shut the door until the counter reached a certain point, then come back and stand in the doorway with the lamp on. No drama, no flashing warnings. I did what it said. When I stepped back into frame, the counter reset. The stream went black. The page turned into a form again, as if it had been bored. and only pretending to be something else. I wanted to take the chest apart with a butter knife. I didn't. I put a towel on top like covering a birdcage and left the room. Later, a printed envelope arrived with a receipt from a locksmith 3 streets away. The date was from the previous week. The amount matched the cash I'd picked up the day before. I stood in the kitchen staring at the paper while something old and heavy settled behind my ribs. Paper can do that. It says you're not imagining things. I made a proper mess of it then. Unscrewed the backboard, laid the chest on its face, tapped every surface with my knuckle until it hurt. Cheap board sounds the same wherever you hit it. When I'd worked up sweat and nothing had changed, I put the back on and shoved the chest into the hallway like punishing it. I slept on the sofa with the bedroom door shut and bathroom light on. The next card asked me to be out during a loose hour in the early evening. There would be something on the kitchen table when I returned. I walked to the co-op and pushed a basket round in circles, buying milk slowly because going home faster felt like letting someone see me hurry. A padded envelope sat on the table when I returned. Inside was a small black cube and short cable. I saw where it had been placed before I plugged it in. A round patch of dust by the bookcase with a clean square in it. The stream now used a slightly different angle. Higher, nearer the corner. I could see the top of my head in the bottom edge when I leaned forward. The counter ticked up. I closed the browser and put the phone under the sofa cushion, then stood in the middle of the room doing nothing, because doing anything would have felt like admitting new rules existed. Payment changed to a station locker. A code at midday. Inside a short stack of notes and a sheet saying everything was satisfactory and I should avoid changing the layout. Advice, not an order. I ignored it. Dragged the bed back where I wanted it, shoved the chest back into the hall, moved the lamp, swapped bulbs for cooler ones. The locksmith changed my cylinder and said the old one was fine. I slept badly, then normally. A person can't keep their shoulders to their ears forever. A month later, the crisp whisper of card on carpet woke me. On the mat, in a clear wallet, sat a laminated strip with my name and flat number and a line about a spare key, along with an old train ticket. The date made my stomach go light. It matched the afternoon I'd first registered the draw. I'd stood at the station then, checking departures, never thinking to wonder who else was looking. I typed the new code. The page split into 2 frames. One showed my hallway from near the coat rack, catching me holding the wallet. The other was a still of the bedroom from head height at the door. The bed sat where I'd pulled it back. The drawer was under the window again, as if it had gone there on its own. The towel I'd dropped 2 days earlier was half a plank left of where I'd left it. That was the part that made my mouth dry, not the camera, the towel. A short instruction asked me to leave the flat. I didn't. I sat on the stair looking at paint drips on the skirting, wiped before they dried. After what felt like a round number of minutes, I went back in. Nothing had moved. The towel was still wrong. I put my palm on the chest top and felt a trace of warmth where the towel had been the night before. The next cash pickup took me under the ring road where the river path echoes. Behind a loose cap on the 3rd steel beam was a rolled envelope. Inside was the same amount and another printed map, this time of the stairwell and bin store. Arrows marked corners. A little circle was drawn at head height next to my door. It wasn't art. It was a list, turned sideways. The night everything tipped was ordinary. I found a plain cardboard box propped against my door. No label, no tape. It opened like it had been opened before. Inside was a black notebook and felt-tip pen. The first page set out neat rules for using the book, like a shared calendar. The next had a grid of days with short items. Take bins down, light off by 11, curtains closed after dusk, side window latched, front door on chain. My name was written inside the cover, steady as a school report. I took it to the bedroom to put on the wardrobe's top shelf. The shelf was lower than it had been. The little pegs were one notch down. A faint dust line marked where it had sat before. I knelt to look at the bottom panel. 2 shallow crescents pressed the carpet pile where toes would rest if someone had stood inside leaning forward. The smell in there wasn't mine. Clean, like fresh gloves. I lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling, white with lazy swirls and a faint stain near the light. In the corner above where the drawer had been, a hairline seam ran in the plaster. I'd never seen it. Now it was the only thing I could see. A place where a cable could be tucked, not high like a smoke alarm, but at the height of a person's eye if they stood and waited. I changed the lock again, borrowed my friend's small van, told him I'd gone off the drawer's look. We carried it down and left it by the recycling cages. I left the notebook on the kitchen table, turned the strange phone off, bought a ticket to the coast. I stayed above a pub where heating rattled and carpet bowed near the wardrobe. I slept with the lamp on and woke tasting dust. When I returned the next afternoon, my door showed no damage. Inside, the air had that cold, empty feel a room gets when no one's breathed in it for a day. The notebook had gone from the table. In its place lay a single sheet, cut from something bigger, like a delivery slip without branding. In neat handwriting, it recorded that a slot had been completed during the hour I was away. Below that, a short list noted that bed orientation, curtain position, drawer placement and latch use had been verified. A final note said the occupant had complied and future access was expected to be uncomplicated. No threats, no names, just a tone that said the work was straightforward. I didn't call anyone. I can pretend it was careful thinking about evidence and timing, but it was simpler. I couldn't face explaining how I'd registered a free drawer on a page that only loads a certain way, then collected envelopes under benches because instructions said there would be money there. I packed a bag, messaged a landlord about a short let I'd seen weeks earlier, and left. On the pavement, I looked back the way people look back at campsites, checking they haven't left rubbish behind. The windows looked like windows. The street looked like a street. It all looked clean. I moved 2 bus rides away with 2 cases and nothing that plugs in except my normal phone charger. I buy furniture new now, keep receipts in a shoebox, sleep with the bed in the room's middle because it makes thoughtless rearrangement harder. I still take bins down when the council asks. Routine makes noise in your head where silence might collect. I don't keep a chime on the hall socket. I don't take parcels for neighbors. I answer the buzzer with the chain on. None of this feels like safety. It feels like being less interesting. Sometimes I wake, not alarmed, just awake, and know without knowing that someone somewhere has ticked through another day I've had. Not photos, not a diary, a quiet grid in a black notebook with my tasks inside it. Lines and crosses placed by a steady hand. It doesn't need storing anywhere clever. That wasn't the point. The point was that it was easy to keep. If you need a lesson, have this plain one. A flat can be read like a form. People will write in the boxes you don't fill. A lens fitted at head height sees a person who thinks they've chosen a safe place to put their head. A key can be cut when you're not looking, even if you changed the cylinder last week. A free drawer can arrive with a bill you don't see until later. The dark web doesn't have to look like masks or codes. Sometimes it looks like care instructions and tidy lists and cash where it says there will be cash. I still see that page in my head, the flat colors, the little counter in the corner, the neat tick when a job is done. I remember the first envelope under the bench and how clever I felt finding money that wasn't really hidden. I remember my breath fogging on the landing when I paused with the drawer. I think about the wardrobe shelf set one notch lower, the two crescents in carpet where toes pressed, the towel half a plank left of where I dropped it, the locksmith's receipt and how numbers on paper make a story feel like it has spine. I changed my number, changed how I throw away packaging, tearing labels, folding boxes small. I don't scan codes that arrive uninvited or touch house clearance furniture. If something comes with a bonus tucked in, I bin the bonus first. If a page offers a $5 for proving an easy fact, I leave it alone. Now and then, I pass the old street because routes cross whether you want them to or not. The bench is still there. The grit bin is still cracked. There's a new leaflet behind lobby glass about upcoming works and different trainers by a first floor door. Buildings keep going. People move in and out. Lights come on and off without meaning anything. I am the only person who stops at the corner and waits for nothing, watching a square of faint yellow like it will say my name if I look long enough. I'll give you one last detail because it's the one I can hold without it slipping. The last morning I woke there, the air in the room felt the same as my skin. No draft, no temperature, just level. A new line had appeared in the dust on the wardrobe's top shelf, where something had rested and been lifted. A thin, clean rectangle, set back an inch from the edge. When I stood on a chair and touched it, my finger made a smudge at one corner and nothing more. It wasn't proof of anything you could hand to someone else. It was a reminder, quiet as a breath, that the lightest thing can leave a mark if it sits still long enough. I shouldn't have kept the drawer. If you came here waiting for a shout or chase or door splintering, that isn't this. This is ordinary things arranged so a person becomes easy to move. The page made space for me to be helpful. The envelopes made it feel like I was included. The lens made the room smaller without changing its size. The notebook turned days into boxes someone else could tick. The rest is what you already know, even if you'd rather not say it out loud. Once you let something simple in, you don't decide where it stops. You only find out where it stopped when you've already left. I shouldn't have signed for the parcel. That's the cleanest way to start, and it's true. A courier said my flat number. I scribbled my name without thinking, and a small box became my problem before I'd finished my tea. The courier had that particular brand of impatience that comes with the territory. Shifting weight from foot to foot, electronic pad already angled toward me before I'd properly opened the door. His high-vis jacket was rain-spotted, and he smelled faintly of diesel and wet cardboard. Behind him, his van sat double-parked with hazards blinking, engine running like a heartbeat, counting down the seconds until he could move on to the next address. I signed because that's what you do when someone arrives at your door with purpose and a clipboard. The transaction felt automatic, muscle memory from years of online shopping and convenience. I hadn't ordered anything. The box was light, almost empty feeling, with the kind of generic brown tape that could have come from anywhere. Inside sat a cheap kitchen timer, the sort you'd find in a pound shop, white plastic with a wind-up mechanism that probably wouldn't last 6 months of normal use. Alongside it was a card with a QR code printed on stock so thin it felt like it might dissolve if you breathed on it wrong. No branding, no receipt, no return address on the package itself. Just my name and flat number written in block capitals with a thick black marker. I left the timer on the worktop next to the kettle, told myself the label had been misread somewhere along the delivery chain and meant to take it back to the depot after work. The plan had that comfortable vagueness of things you intend to do but probably won't follow through on. I forgot the way you forget to water plants or call relatives back. Late that evening, when the flat had settled into its familiar quiet and I'd run out of reasonable ways to avoid thinking about the day, curiosity made a good case for itself. I scanned the code. The QR reader hesitated for a moment, as if uncertain, then opened a page that only loads on the dark web. I'm not an expert on these things. I just recognize the type of address from the sort of articles that make it sound novel and dangerous, like urban exploration for people who never leave their computers. The page was almost empty. Black background, pale text that seemed to glow against the darkness of my phone screen. A thin progress line that didn't seem to do much beyond prove something was loading. In the center was a live view of a stairwell. It looked like mine, painted brick walls with that particular shade of institutional cream that housing associations favor. A black handrail worn smooth by countless hands. The same wonky recycling notice by the fire door that had been askew for months. Someone had stuck it up carelessly, and no one had bothered to straighten it since. The image quality was grainy but clear enough to make me uncomfortable. A small counter in the corner ticked up steadily. Beneath it sat a single line of text. Place the kitchen timer on the landing rail at the top of the stairs within the next few minutes. I closed the page and stared at the kettle like it held an answer to a question I hadn't properly formed yet. The timer sat there looking innocent and slightly pathetic, the sort of object that might gather dust in a drawer for years before finally getting thrown away in a house move. But there was something about the precision of the instruction, the casual certainty that I would follow it, that made my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't name yet. Then I picked up the timer, stepped out into the corridor, and climbed to the landing. The building felt different at night, more aware of itself, full of small sounds that disappeared during the day. Pipes ticking as they cooled, the distant hum of someone's television through thin walls, the soft mechanical breathing of the lift shaft. I balanced the timer on the rail and wound it until it ticked with that urgent, impatient sound that kitchen timers make. The metal was cold under my fingers. Back in my flat, I watched the countdown on my phone, refreshing the page every few seconds like I was waiting for exam results. The image never changed, just the empty stairwell, the timer perched on the rail like a small white bird. When the bell rang, sharp and artificial in the corridor's silence, the image flickered once and steadied. Nothing else happened. No door opened. No figure appeared in frame. The camera just kept its patient watch. I checked the plant pot in the lobby before bed, more out of nervous energy than expectation, and saw nothing. The lobby felt larger at night, shadows pooling in corners where the overhead lights couldn't reach. In the morning, pressed between pot and wall like a secret being passed along, there was an envelope with my name written in the same thick black marker. Inside was a £10 note, crisp and new, and silence that felt heavier than the money. It felt like a prank made to prove a point about how little it takes to move a person. A social experiment maybe, or some art student's thesis project on urban compliance. The kind of thing that would make sense in a gallery context, with a placard explaining the theoretical framework. 2 days later, a second parcel arrived. This time I hesitated before signing, pen hovering over the electronic pad while the courier waited with practiced patience. But hesitation isn't the same as refusal, and muscle memory won out again. The box held self-adhesive hooks, the sort you stick to bathroom tiles to hang towels, a small roll of clear tape, and another card with the familiar QR code. The same page loaded, only this time the camera had moved to sit lower, tucked somewhere behind the fire extinguisher near the glass front door. The view took in the entrance area, the row of postboxes with their scratched metal doors, the first few steps of the main staircase. The instruction was more specific this time. Tape a hook to the underside of the top step above the postboxes on the left, so the dark edge of it shows just beyond the lip if you crouch and look up. It felt petty and technical and almost funny, like following instructions in a particularly boring manual. I pressed the hook into place with my thumb, the adhesive strip warming slightly under pressure. The positioning had to be exact, visible from below but not obvious to anyone walking normally up the stairs. I found myself checking the angles, making small adjustments, taking an odd satisfaction in getting it precisely right. When I walked away, I listened for any door opening, any sound that might indicate I was being watched, but heard nothing except the building's usual background hum. Later that evening, I refreshed the page and watched the stream show a gloved hand reach carefully into frame. The hand moved with deliberate economy, hanging a tiny metal tag on the hook, something small and dark that caught the light briefly before settling into shadow. The hand withdrew quickly, like a fox slipping through a garden, there and gone in the space between one breath and the next. Watching it felt like witnessing something I wasn't supposed to see, even though the whole point was clearly that I should see it. The next morning, another envelope was tucked behind the pot. More cash, another £10 note with the same crisp newness, and one neat sentence written in blue ballpoint. The hook has been helpful and more will be expected soon. The handwriting was careful, anonymous, the sort of script you might use when filling out official forms. The third parcel landed on a Friday morning when I was meant to catch a train to Derby to see my stepdad. I nearly ignored the buzzer because I was running late and had that particular kind of pre-journey anxiety that makes every small delay feel catastrophic. But the sound was insistent, and ignoring buzzers in a building like ours feels antisocial in a way that's hard to explain. The box held a rubber door wedge, the triangular kind that probably cost less than £1, a small USB torch with a wrist strap, and a card with the same QR link. The camera had moved again, this time facing the rear corridor by the exit to the bin store. This part of the building always felt forgotten, narrower than the main corridors, with pipes running along the ceiling and a persistent smell of damp concrete. The instruction was simple. Wedge the rear door ajar at roughly this time this evening. Shine the torch once into the corridor so the lens flares white. Walk away and return after a short while to remove the wedge. Payment will be the same. I moved my train by an hour, called my stepdad to explain I'd be late, and spent the afternoon with a low-level anxiety humming in my chest like a phone set to vibrate. When evening came, I did exactly what was asked. The torch beam fogged the image for a second, turning the screen pure white before settling back to show the empty corridor. Within a minute, a finger appeared at the glass from the outside, just the tip of one finger tapping once against the door like a coded message. I removed the wedge and locked the door, testing the handle twice to make sure it was secure. Another envelope was waiting that night, and I told myself it was some odd favor for a neighbor who liked sending people on little errands. Maybe someone with mobility issues who couldn't manage stairs easily, or an older resident who'd worked out an elaborate system for getting help without having to ask directly. The explanation felt comfortable, so I let it settle and tried not to think too hard about the finger at the glass. There was a man 2 doors down who carried a gym bag most mornings. He'd helped me with a flat-pack wardrobe once, holding panels steady while I fumbled with the Allen key making the sort of cheerful small talk that makes mundane tasks bearable. He held doors for people with pushchairs and took parcels in when neighbors were out. The kind of casual community-minded gesture that keeps apartment buildings functioning. I mention him now because later I saw his photo on a local news website and recognized the same forearms and half smile. And I want you to understand that I knew who he was as a person before I knew what happened to him. Before his photo appeared in the news, the tasks kept creeping towards something that, at first glance, still looked normal. The next delivery contained blank lanyard sleeves, the sort used for conferences and workplace ID cards, and a set of numbered cards with official-looking fonts. The page asked me to slide one card into a sleeve and hang it on the hook under the step, then sit on the stairs at a particular minute and pretend to scroll through my phone. I positioned myself on the third step up from the lobby, back against the wall, trying to look like someone killing time while waiting for a friend or a delivery. The building hummed around me with the particular sounds that old blocks make when pipes move hot water around and lift motors cycle through their routines. A woman with a pushchair needed help with the heavy front door, and I stood automatically to hold it open, feeling like I was breaking a rule I hadn't been told about, but should somehow understand. Later, I watched a grainy loop of myself looking appropriately bored and absorbed in my phone screen. The footage had that slightly unreal quality of security camera footage, compressed and pixelated in a way that made everything look like it was happening underwater. The lanyard had vanished from the hook. Another envelope appeared behind the plant pot the next morning. Another £10 note. Another brief message. Timing was good. I kept telling myself I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd stuck a hook under a step and wedged a door for a few minutes. I'd placed a cheap lanyard where no one would notice unless they were specifically looking for it. The requests were clearly designed to make me feel like a bystander to my own actions, a bit player in someone else's story. That was the point, I thought, to demonstrate how easily ordinary people could be drawn into small conspiracies without ever feeling like conspirators. One morning, the man with the gym bag didn't collect a parcel from the lobby shelf where the postman leaves packages too big for the slots. It sat there all day, a brown box with his name clearly visible on the label, the sort of thing that usually disappears within hours of being delivered. In the evening, someone on the building's WhatsApp group asked if anyone had seen him, because his phone was going straight to voicemail and he'd missed a standing arrangement. I wasn't part of the group. I'd never been one for building social media, but I saw a screenshot from a neighbor who forwards everything. We all know how that kind of question changes a corridor. People start looking through peepholes before stepping out, and the lift feels like a waiting room where everyone's pretending not to be anxious. Conversations by the postboxes become briefer, more purposeful. The building's rhythm shifts in subtle ways, like a piece of music played slightly too fast. The next parcel contained a heavy padlock with a brass body and a chrome shackle, and a key that looked newly cut. The page told me to swap the old lock on the rear gate for this one at roughly 2 o'clock the following afternoon, then hang the old lock with the new key threaded through it on the inside mesh of the gate, and shut the gate without engaging the latch. Someone would collect the old lock shortly after. I did it because by then, consistency felt safer than refusal, and because not doing it felt like stepping suddenly into harsh light after hours in comfortable darkness. The old lock came away easily. The screws were already loose, as if someone had prepared for this moment. The new lock clicked into place with satisfying precision. I threaded the key through the old lock shackle and hung it where the instructions specified, testing to make sure it was secure but easily removable. I can't pretend I didn't think about the man with the gym bag as I turned the screwdriver. The weight of the old lock in my hand felt significant in a way I couldn't articulate. That night, I listened through the thin wall that separated our flats, straining to hear his usual evening routine. The shower running, music playing softly, the familiar domestic sounds that form the background soundtrack of apartment living. I heard nothing. Another day passed, then another. It's remarkable how easily a person slips out of the rhythm of a building, and how the building just continues its routines as if nothing has changed. I tried, briefly, to ignore the page. For 3 days, I didn't scan the code that came with the next package. The box sat unopened on my kitchen counter, and I told myself this was where I drew the line. Then a message arrived on the throwaway email account I'd used for parcel delivery confirmations, an account I thought was anonymous and forgotten. The message contained a link, a specific time, and a request to watch. The casual certainty that I would comply felt like a hand on the back of my neck. I watched. The stream showed the view from inside the bin store, that concrete-walled space at the back of the building where the wheelie bins lived among the spider webs, and the perpetual smell of decomposition. The camera sat somewhere high near a water pipe, looking down at the metal bin frames and plastic lids that never quite fitted properly. Even through the screen, I could almost taste that heavy, sour smell that clings to the back of your throat. A countdown timer appeared in the corner and began to sink towards 0. When it reached the minute I'd been given, the rear door opened with the particular grinding sound it made when the bottom scraped against the concrete threshold. 2 people pushed a trolley in, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who belonged there. The trolley carried flat boxes wrapped in brown paper and plastic sheeting, packages that looked official and mundane and somehow ominous all at once. They worked quickly and methodically, arranging the boxes with care, checking something on a phone screen, making small adjustments to the positioning. The stream didn't provide sound I could properly follow, just a muffled echo that might have been voices or might have been the building's ventilation system. When they finished, they left as quietly as they'd arrived, and the door eased shut, as if the building had taken a slow, careful breath. The official updates, when they came, arrived without drama. A small memorial appeared by the front door, a cheap bouquet from a supermarket, and a laminated photo of the man with the gym bag, his arm around a golden retriever, both of them squinting into sunshine somewhere that looked like a park. Someone from the council knocked on doors, asking routine questions about whether we'd noticed anything unusual with the bins, any strange smells, any disturbances in the area. People began double locking their flat doors and checking the spy holes before answering knocks. A few new faces appeared in the building, taking over flats that had suddenly become available. The turnover felt faster than usual, but housing in this part of town moved quickly anyway. Days grew thinner, more cautious. I tried to keep my head down and treat stillness like safety, avoiding eye contact in corridors and timing my comings and goings to minimize encounters. Another parcel arrived wrapped like a book, the kind of careful packaging that suggested contents more fragile than kitchen timers and door wedges. Inside was a stack of small laminated cards with official-looking notices printed in the same font the Housing Association used for maintenance announcements. The page asked me to slide one under the door of flat 3B after dark. The card explained that there would be a routine fire alarm test the following day, and residents shouldn't be concerned if they heard people in high-visibility jackets moving through the corridors during that period. It sounded exactly like the dull, bureaucratic notices that appeared regularly in our postboxes, the kind of thing you scan quickly before recycling. I did it because fear of the alternative had already moved into my flat like an unwelcome roommate, settling into corners and making itself comfortable. The card slipped easily under the door with barely a whisper of sound. The next morning, 2 men in safety vests walked past my door in perfect step, their boots making identical sounds on the corridor carpet. They vanished through the rear exit I'd wedged open weeks earlier, and I realized I was holding my breath until I heard the door click shut behind them. The page showed only the stairwell, looping calmly as always. The timer in the corner kept ticking with what felt like mechanical commentary on my complicity. The parcel that felt like a threat before I even opened it arrived on a Tuesday morning when rain was turning the windows grey and the building felt more enclosed than usual. My name was printed in block capitals across the brown paper, and the weight distribution felt wrong. Too light in some places, too heavy in others. Inside was a plug-in door chime, the sort you buy in the electrical aisle of supermarkets, and a small black wireless button with adhesive pads on the back. The card's instructions were precise. Place the chime in the hallway near the front door. Fix the button outside above the letterbox where the postman would see it, but might not think to comment on it. The accompanying link now showed a view looking outward through the building's glass front door to the street beyond. A final line said that when the chime sounded, I was to do nothing at all. Just listen and wait, and continue whatever I was doing as if nothing had happened. It rang once, in the small hours when the building was deepest in sleep, and the only sound should have been heating pipes and distant traffic. A single, neat electronic tone that seemed to hang in the air longer than it actually lasted. I lay in bed waiting for a second chime that never came. My heart rate elevated in the specific way that comes from being woken by unfamiliar sounds. The building stayed perfectly still around me. It rang again, after what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes. Then silence that stretched until I fell back into thin, restless sleep, full of dreams about corridors and cameras and hands reaching through letterboxes. When I woke properly, grey daylight was seeping through the curtains and rain was still tapping against the windows like someone asking politely to be let in. When I opened the door for my usual morning trip to the corner shop for bread and milk, the button had vanished. Only a small smear of adhesive remained on the paintwork, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. An envelope lay on the doormat, not behind the plant pot this time, but directly addressed to me in a way that felt like an escalation. The photo inside showed my hallway from a low angle, taken through the letterbox slot, looking toward the chime plugged into the socket by the front door. No message accompanied it. The point was proximity, intimacy, the demonstration that privacy was an illusion I'd been allowed to maintain until now. Another link arrived in my email later that day with a timestamp for the evening. I watched because obedience had become a reflex, a learned response that bypassed conscious decision-making. The camera had moved again to cover the main lobby, the postboxes with their scratched metal faces, the first stretch of corridor, and just enough of the stairwell to catch movement between floors. The timer counted down to the specified minute. At exactly the right moment, the main door opened and 3 men entered. 2 carried a step ladder between them with practiced ease, while the third followed with a package tucked under his arm like something valuable and fragile. They moved through the space with the confidence of people who had studied the building's rhythms and understood its weak points. One of them went straight to the lift and pressed the call button. The second set up the step ladder with quick, efficient movements. The third approached the post boxes. spun the combination dials on 2 different boxes as if he had memorized the numbers, and slid his package into one of the opened compartments. Then he paused, facing the stairs in a way that suggested he was checking the quality of silence rather than looking for any specific person. I closed the stream and sat holding my phone like it might provide warmth or comfort. The image of the man's pause stayed with me, that moment of professional assessment, cataloguing the building's mood and finding it satisfactory for whatever came next. Later that day, the police posted an update saying they were renewing their appeal for information about a second person, last seen in the company of the missing man. They were particularly keen to trace anyone who had received unexpected parcels or packages recently. I tried to imagine calling the number provided and explaining the correct amount of truth, enough to be helpful, not enough to implicate myself in whatever had been happening around me. My throat tightened with the petty anxiety that comes when you've run for a bus and then changed your mind at the last moment, leaving you stranded on the pavement feeling foolish and conspicuous. How do you explain that you've been following instructions without understanding their purpose? That you've been complicit in something you can't name? That night the chime rang again, once, and stopped. In the morning, there was another envelope behind the plant pot. No cash this time. Just a laminated card with a single sentence that read like a line from a workplace safety manual. Prop the front door open tomorrow for a short window after 9 a.m. The instruction had the bland authority of something that shouldn't be questioned, the kind of request that sounds reasonable until you think about it too carefully. I stood at the top of the main staircase and looked down at the entrance, at the heavy door with its security lock, and the thin mat where packages sometimes waited for collection. I thought about how small actions accumulate into patterns you don't recognize until it's too late to pretend you don't understand what you've been part of. The front door was propped open at the specified time the next day, not by me. A folded gym leaflet sat wedged under the bottom edge like a paper tongue, holding the door just wide enough to slip through without triggering the automatic closing mechanism. I watched from the window of the stairwell, 3 floors up, as 2 familiar figures approached from the street with the unhurried confidence of people keeping appointments. I understood then that my part in this had never been essential. I had been used to test the building's rhythms and vulnerabilities, to establish patterns and timing, to identify the residents who noticed things and those who didn't. The serious work, whatever that had been, no longer needed my small contributions. They had mapped the building's habits, learned the names on the buzzers, developed an intuitive feel for who left when and which doors stayed locked during the day. I had been the practice run, the proof of concept, someone's experiment in urban compliance and the gradual erosion of boundaries. The realization felt like discovering you've been playing a game where only one person knew the rules. I moved a few weeks later, citing work commitments to the letting agent rather than trying to explain the real reasons. My deposit went toward a smaller place across town, near a parade of shops where the woman behind the post office counter learns your name if you visit regularly enough. The new building has thicker doors, better locks, and no convenient plant pot by the entrance where messages might be left. I don't keep electronic chimes plugged into wall sockets anymore. I still answer the door buzzer because social conditioning runs deep, but I look through the peephole each time and keep the security chain engaged until I'm certain about who's calling. It makes me feel both faintly ridiculous and more genuinely awake than I'd been in years. This isn't a public service announcement or a warning designed to make you more suspicious of your neighbors. It's just a record of how soft pressure works when applied in careful increments. A package arrives, containing something boring and unthreatening. A web page asks for a favor that costs nothing and harms no one. The first task pays for itself and makes you feel clever for discovering a small, victimless corner of urban life where rules are more flexible than you'd assumed. The second favor hides behind helpfulness and community spirit. The third is about timing and access. The fourth introduces the possibility of consequences you hadn't considered. Then someone you know by sight vanishes from the building's daily rhythms, and a cheap bouquet appears by the front door. A laminated card slides under a neighbor's door, and people in high-visibility vests walk through secure areas because no one looks twice at official-seeming uniforms. If you want an ending with resolution and justice, I don't have one to offer. Take the simplest version instead. A door on a damp morning, held open by a gym advertisement. A pair of men who look like they belong, walking into a building without hurry or concern. A third who pauses in the lobby and seems to glance up toward the higher floors, as if checking the time or confirming that expected schedules are being maintained. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make witnesses out of bystanders. Just the slow, methodical click of small tasks becoming a comprehensive plan, of individual complicity adding up to collective vulnerability. I don't scan random QR codes anymore. I dispose of unsolicited cards and packages without opening them. I still think sometimes about that first kitchen timer ticking on the landing, the mechanical bell that rang in an empty corridor, and the brief moment of relief I felt when nothing immediately dramatic happened. That might have been the safest moment in the entire sequence, when I knew just enough to be curious, but not enough to be properly frightened. Now I know more, and the knowledge isn't particularly useful. It just sits there in the back of my mind, quiet and patient as a plant pot by a door, waiting for the next person to reach into it without thinking to look first. The game is still being played, I'm certain of that. Somewhere in the city, someone is signing for a package they didn't order, and curiosity is making its usual persuasive case for just one small favor, one tiny compromise, one harmless step across a line they can't yet see. The package arrived on a Monday morning while I was having coffee in my kitchen, addressed to me by name, but with no return address or delivery company markings. Just a plain brown box sitting on my doorstep, like it had materialized overnight. Inside was a laptop I'd never seen before, expensive looking, but completely unmarked, along with a handwritten note explaining that I'd been selected for a freelance research project that would pay £500 for a few days' work. I was 29 and struggling to keep my freelance writing career viable, mostly producing content for local businesses and the occasional magazine article when editors needed someone who could work quickly and cheaply. The money being offered was more than I usually earned in a month. The note was brief and professional, explaining that the research involved documenting online communities that weren't accessible through normal browsers. Nothing illegal, just academic investigation of how information spreads through hidden networks that most people never encounter. They'd chosen me based on my journalism background and writing samples they'd found online, looking for someone who could observe and document without technical preconceptions about what they might discover. The laptop came preloaded with software I'd never used before, along with detailed instructions for accessing what they called alternative information networks. The process was more complex than regular internet browsing, involving multiple steps and security protocols that suggested the content wasn't meant for casual access. I should have been more suspicious about receiving expensive equipment from anonymous sources, but the financial pressure of freelance work made the opportunity difficult to refuse. £500 would solve several immediate problems and buy me time to find more reliable income. The first communities I accessed were disappointingly mundane. Discussion groups about privacy rights, archives of academic papers, forums where people shared information that had been censored from mainstream platforms. Exactly the sort of content you'd expect researchers to study. But as I explored more widely, following links and recommendations between different communities, I began encountering material that was considerably more disturbing than academic research. Not obviously illegal content, but documentation of activities that mainstream platforms wouldn't host. Real-time discussions about events that weren't being reported in normal news sources. Communities sharing information about incidents they claimed were being deliberately suppressed. The research brief had asked me to focus particularly on communities discussing local events, incidents in Newcastle, and the surrounding areas that might not be receiving broader media attention. I found several groups dedicated to what they called regional intelligence. People sharing information about activities in their immediate geographic areas that weren't appearing in local newspapers or radio broadcasts. The Newcastle section was surprisingly active, with dozens of regular contributors discussing everything from local authority decisions to business activities that weren't being publicly reported. Some posts included photographic evidence supporting claims about incidents that had supposedly occurred, but weren't being covered by local media. Images of accident scenes, building damage, even what appeared to be emergency service activities that hadn't been mentioned in official reports. The documentation quality was often professional, suggesting either serious amateur investigators or people with official access to information that wasn't being shared publicly. One thread that particularly caught my attention focused on missing persons cases in the Northeast that hadn't received media coverage. Contributors shared details about people who had disappeared without official investigations being launched, or families being properly informed about search efforts. The cases they discussed weren't random disappearances, but seemed to follow patterns that suggested systematic targeting of specific types of individuals. People living alone, working irregular hours, without strong family connections that would ensure immediate reporting of their absence. I recognized some of the locations being discussed, areas of Newcastle where I'd worked on assignments, neighborhoods I was familiar with from my journalism research. The proximity made the content feel more immediate and credible than if it had been about distant places. As I documented these communities for my research assignment, I started cross-referencing their claims with official sources and mainstream news reports. What I discovered was disturbing. Many of the incidents they discussed had indeed occurred, but with minimal official acknowledgement and virtually no media coverage. Missing person reports that had been filed but not publicized, accident investigations that had been conducted but not reported, even criminal activities that had been recorded but not prosecuted. Either the hidden communities had access to official information that wasn't being shared publicly, or they were conducting their own investigations into incidents that authorities were choosing not to pursue. I started contributing to the discussions, sharing information I'd gathered through my journalism work that might be relevant to their research. Nothing confidential, just background context about local issues that could help verify or contradict claims being made. The response was immediate and encouraging. Other contributors provided additional information that helped me understand connections between different incidents, patterns that weren't obvious when each event was considered individually. They also began sharing more sensitive material with me, including documentation that suggested some of the missing persons cases were connected to activities that were being deliberately concealed from public scrutiny. Photographs of locations where people had last been seen, records of their final communications, even evidence that their disappearances had been noted by authorities, but not investigated with appropriate thoroughness. The material painted a picture of systematic negligence or deliberate concealment, with certain types of disappearances being treated as administrative problems rather than potential crimes requiring investigation. I should have reported this information to appropriate authorities, rather than continuing to participate in communities that were clearly operating outside official oversight. But I was becoming genuinely concerned about the patterns they were documenting, and traditional journalism hadn't provided opportunities to investigate issues that weren't being acknowledged by official sources. About 6 weeks into my research, I received additional instructions that shifted the focus of my assignment. Rather than just documenting existing communities, I was asked to investigate specific cases that had been identified as potentially significant. People who had disappeared under circumstances that suggested they might be connected to activities that weren't being properly investigated. The cases were all local to Newcastle, involving individuals who shared characteristics that made their disappearances particularly concerning. All lived alone, all worked from home, or had irregular employment. All had minimal family connections that would ensure immediate reporting of problems. I was provided with detailed background information about each case, personal histories, work patterns, social connections, even financial circumstances that might make them vulnerable to exploitation. The level of detail was impressive, but also unsettling. Someone had conducted comprehensive research into these individuals' private lives, gathering information that wouldn't be available through normal journalism or official investigation. I started investigating the cases using traditional journalism methods, contacting police departments, searching public records, trying to verify the claims that these disappearances weren't being properly investigated. What I discovered confirmed the hidden community's allegations about systematic negligence. Most of the cases had indeed been reported to authorities, but with minimal follow-up investigation. Missing person reports had been filed, but searches had been perfunctory, and investigations had been closed quickly without resolution. The pattern suggested either severe resource limitations affecting police response to certain types of cases, or deliberate decisions to avoid thorough investigation of disappearances that met specific criteria. I documented my findings and shared them with the hidden communities, hoping to contribute to their ongoing research into systematic problems with missing person investigations. But I also started to notice changes in my own circumstances that seemed connected to my investigation activities. People I'd contacted during my research began experiencing problems that interfered with their ability to provide information. Sources became reluctant to discuss cases they'd previously been willing to address openly. Some contacts mentioned receiving warnings about sharing information with journalists, though they couldn't identify who had contacted them or what authority they represented. My own internet connectivity became unreliable when accessing certain types of information, and I started experiencing technical problems with equipment that had previously functioned normally. Most unsettling was discovering that people were asking questions about my research activities in contexts that suggested my investigation was being monitored by individuals with access to information I hadn't shared publicly. I researched methods for conducting journalism investigations without creating unnecessary visibility for sources or subjects, but realized that my activities had already attracted attention from people who had resources to monitor and interfere with independent research. The hidden communities provided advice about protecting investigation activities from unwanted scrutiny, but also warned that certain types of research could create personal risks for investigators who weren't prepared for retaliation. Several contributors mentioned experiencing harassment after their documentation had led to official attention, including professional difficulties financial problems, and even personal safety concerns. They advised extreme caution when investigating cases that might be connected to activities involving people with official authority or significant resources. This advice proved relevant sooner than I'd expected. About 2 months after beginning my research, I received a visit that made it clear my investigation activities had attracted unwanted attention. 2 people arrived at my flat, claiming to represent a government agency investigating unauthorized access to sensitive information. They were polite but thorough, asking detailed questions about my research methods and the sources of information I'd been accessing. They seemed particularly interested in the hidden communities I'd been participating in, asking whether I'd identified other contributors or learned about similar research activities in different regions. Their knowledge of my investigation was comprehensive, suggesting either sophisticated monitoring of my online activities or information provided by sources within the communities I'd been researching. They explained that some of the cases I'd been investigating were connected to ongoing official operations that required confidentiality to maintain effectiveness. My journalism research was potentially compromising legitimate law enforcement activities by drawing unwanted attention to sensitive investigations. They didn't threaten me directly, but made it clear that continuing my research could create legal complications that would be difficult to resolve through normal journalism channels. In exchange for discontinuing my investigation, they were prepared to provide background information that would help me understand why certain missing person cases weren't being pursued through traditional methods. The explanation sounded plausible, but their approach made me uncomfortable. The level of surveillance they demonstrated suggested resources that went far beyond normal law enforcement oversight of journalism activities. I agreed to discontinue my research while privately resolving to verify their claims through independent sources. Over the next few weeks, I tried to confirm the legitimacy of the agency they claimed to represent and the official operations they described. I found no corroborating evidence for their explanation. No government agencies matching their description. No official operations that could account for the systematic negligence I documented. No legitimate reasons why missing person investigations would be deliberately restricted. Either their work was so classified that no public information existed, or the explanation had been fabricated to discourage my investigation. I returned to the hidden communities to share my concerns and seek advice about verifying official claims that couldn't be independently researched. The response was immediate and alarming. Several community members reported similar experiences. Official contact after investigating sensitive cases, explanations that couldn't be verified, pressure to discontinue research that had identified problematic patterns. Some contributors had been threatened with prosecution for accessing classified information, though the classification of their research couldn't be verified through normal channels. Others had experienced escalating problems that made continuing their investigation impossible. Technical difficulties, financial pressures, even personal safety concerns that forced them to abandon their research. The pattern suggested coordinated efforts to discourage investigation of activities that were operating without proper oversight or accountability. I started researching the individuals who had visited me, trying to understand their actual authority and whether their claims about official operations could be substantiated. The business cards they'd provided led to addresses that didn't correspond to legitimate government offices, and the phone numbers connected to generic voicemail systems that provided no useful information. Either they were operating with extraordinary secrecy protocols, or they represented interests that weren't connected to legitimate law enforcement activities. I was beginning to understand that I'd stumbled across something considerably more complex than systematic negligence in missing person investigations. The patterns I documented were likely evidence of activities that were being conducted outside official oversight, with missing persons cases being deliberately ignored to avoid scrutiny of whatever was causing the disappearances. The hidden communities had become a way for people to document and share information about these activities, creating alternative investigation networks for cases that weren't being pursued through official channels. But participation had also made us visible to people who had resources to monitor our research and motivation to discourage our documentation. Last week, I discovered something that confirmed my worst suspicions about how closely my activities were being monitored. The laptop that had been provided for my research assignment contained sophisticated surveillance software that had been recording not just my investigation activities, but all my computer usage, internet communications, and even ambient audio from my flat. I'd been under comprehensive observation since the moment I'd accepted the research assignment, with everything I'd discovered, everyone I'd contacted, and every piece of evidence I'd gathered being monitored by people who had provided the tools for my investigation. The realization that my research had been watched from the beginning made me understand that the assignment itself had been part of a system designed to identify and monitor people who might investigate activities that weren't meant to be scrutinized. The £500 had been payment for allowing myself to be surveilled while investigating cases that were connected to activities someone wanted to keep hidden. I'd essentially been recruited to document my own investigation, providing comprehensive intelligence about my methods, sources, and findings to people who could use that information to prevent similar research by others. The package that had started everything sits in my desk drawer now, containing evidence of surveillance that extends far beyond my own investigation, to include systematic monitoring of anyone who asks inconvenient questions about missing persons cases in the Northeast. I still write freelance articles for local businesses, still struggle with the financial uncertainty of independent journalism, still wonder which of my sources might be experiencing problems because I contacted them during research that was being monitored from the beginning. But I'm also aware that my investigation activities are being recorded, my communications are being monitored, and my research methods are being studied by people who turn curiosity about systematic problems into comprehensive intelligence gathering about the people asking questions. I should have left it alone. That is the simplest way to start, and the truest. I am not looking for sympathy. I am putting a marker in the ground so you understand that the first choice was small and boring and felt safe enough to carry home in my pocket. It began with a dull sentence on a page that did not normally have anything interesting on it. I was in my flat in Nottingham on a wet afternoon, half scrolling for second-hand tools because my shed had been cleared out a few weeks earlier, half letting the radio mumble across the room. Someone had written that there was a quicker catalogue for local errands and verifications. Then I copied it into a new window because telling yourself not to touch something is a good way to make sure you do. The page that opened was plain. It belonged to a plain corner of the dark web that pretended to be a jobs board. The tasks were written like tickets. Each one had an area, a time window, and the proof required. Photograph a front door with the number visible. Record a short clip of the corner of a lane. Note whether a side window uses obscured glass. Confirm whether a streetlight sits between two driveways. Payment was cash in envelopes collected from specified spots after the upload had been verified. The first task was a short walk from my street and offered enough to cover groceries. I took it with the neat lie that I could stop at any time. It asked for 3 things: a photo of a door on a quiet quiet road near the park, a half-minute video of the alley between two terraces that fed onto a lane, and a rough note about the rear wall height based on where it reached against a shoulder. I put my phone at hip height, walked past, filmed the alley, glanced at the wall, and went home feeling like I had pinched a coin from a fountain. The envelope was under the third step of a canal footbridge, tucked beside a bolt. There was enough inside to feel like a reward, and not enough to smell like a trap. The next task appeared the following day. Check the sight line of a public camera near the tram stop, then a turning circle at the end of a cul-de-sac, then the type of glass in a porch window. The fourth job changed the tone. It asked me to note the arrival time of a bin lorry on a particular street over several mornings. That was the first time repetition appeared. I walked there with coffee, stood where I could see without being obvious, and wrote rough times in my notes. I sent a tidy summary and got a different kind of reply. Instead of a bland receipt, it contained a numbered list. Wait at a bus stop near a given house on a specific morning. Carry a flat cardboard parcel in a plain paper bag. When the bin lorry stops by the green bins outside the house, place the parcel on top of a lid and keep walking. Collect payment later from a locker at the station. The parcel was light. The paper bag had a generic print from a stationery shop. Nobody looked at me. I placed it on the bin as the lorry braked, walked on without breaking pace, and stood at a corner feeling foolish until I felt normal again. The locker opened with the code I had been sent. The cash was crisp. I should have stopped there. I did not. From then on, the errands became a quiet second job. I told myself I had a line because I refused anything that crossed the threshold. It sounded responsible. It was nonsense. The task that broke it looked indistinguishable at first glance. Confirm a cat flap at the rear of a house near the ring road. Record 30 seconds of the lane behind at dusk. Leave a small packet in the third wheelie bin along, to be collected the next day. The description suggested it contained a USB for audio testing, which was supposed to make it wholesome. I did the things and went home. 2 days later, the house appeared on the local news. The language was careful. The police were appealing for information about a woman who had not been seen since the previous evening. The camera held on the same front door I had photographed, and the hanging basket looked brighter with blue tape strung across the path. The feeling was not a shock. It was the sound of gears joining, the little clicks that turned separate cogs into a single wheel. Every small thing I had done found its place in a machine that did not care how I explained myself. I read back through the completed errands and saw them properly, timing a vehicle, checking a light, mapping an approach, placing a parcel on a bin at a fixed moment, making a phone ring somewhere at a minute that mattered. It was choreography for intruders, and the part I played required nothing more than being boring and reliable. I wanted to tell the police. I also wanted to sit in a park until dark. I did neither. I went quiet and hoped quiet would make it cleaner. The first message arrived that evening, sent to an email address I used for shopping. No greeting, no sign-off, just a link and a timestamp. The construction matched the voice of the errands. I pressed the link. A plain video page opened with a small counter ticking up in a corner. The image was a room like a garage. Bare concrete, a strip light, a chair, a woman, ankles taped to the legs, head tipped forward. I watched the steady buzz of the light until the stream froze and a single line of instruction replaced it. Check under your doormat. I locked the front door and stood in the hallway like a guest who had walked into the wrong flat. Then I opened it a fraction, reached out, and lifted the mat. There was an envelope underneath, thin and ordinary. Inside was a printed photo of my front door. shot from the communal hall through the gap, angled in a way that meant someone had leaned in. No note, no demand. The proof was the point. Another message followed with a code for a locker at the station. I collected a small rucksack that night and brought it home. Inside I found a tiny cube camera, a roll of gaffer tape, a clear pencil case with cable ties and a marker, a pair of nitrile gloves, a disposable phone still wrapped, and a single sheet of A4 with a numbered list. Tape the camera under the lip of a shelf facing the sofa. Plug in the disposable phone and leave it charging. Remove your watch and place it on the arm of the sofa. Sit. I did those things with the measured care you give to fragile objects, except the fragile object was my day. The disposable phone lit up with a link that opened to a live view of my living room from the camera I had just taped in place. Watching yourself in your own room, as if your room was somewhere else, is an odd sensation. A photo arrived showing my back door lock in close detail, the kind of close that reveals tiny scratches you have never seen. Another list asked me to gather items I already owned. Cling film, a towel, a small torch, a bin liner, and paracetamol. I placed them on the table one by one and held each to the lens for a second, because the list said to, and because the counter kept climbing, and because obedience felt like the only thing left that might keep the shape of this from turning worse. The next steps sent me from room to room with the torch, keeping the disposable phone pointed so the viewers could see the beam. Viewers is a word I had avoided until the number in the corner demanded it. I found nothing under the bed. I found a tiny lens embedded in the radiator cover facing the bed. I found another glued under a kitchen cupboard and one inside the cooker hood. I found one behind a notch above the bathroom mirror and one hidden inside the casing of the hallway smoke alarm. Each time I placed the lens on the towel and filmed the neat little row, like evidence in a petty case I had brought against myself. A short instruction told me to drop the lenses into the bin liner, not the top, and wait. The stream split into 2 frames. The top showed my living room. The bottom returned to the garage and the woman in the chair. A timer appeared between them and began to count down from a number chosen to look manageable and feel like a cliff. I stared at it because looking away would make no difference, and because the light in my room and the light in the garage now felt like parts of the same machine. Another message told me to swallow 2 tablets dry, hold my watch to the camera, put on the gloves, carry the bag of lenses to the back door, step into the yard, and leave the bag by the bins. The small sound of the latch made my skin crawl. Cold air touched my face. I put the bag down and came back in, because the list told me to come back in. I had understood by then that the objects were not the point. The movements were the point. This was a set of positions written in a tone that made refusal feel like misreading. The next instruction told me to turn off the ceiling light, tilt the lamp until the pool of light cut across my face, pull a length of cling film the size of my forearm, and lay it on the table. The split view flickered. A shadow moved out of frame in the garage. The timer crawled. Then I was told to wrap the cling film around my forearm 3 times, hold it to the lens, unwrap it, lay it flat, write the time on it with the marker, and stick a piece of tape on the corner. Then to lift the shelf camera for a second and put it back exactly as before. Each neat action tightened something in me. Exactness turns a person into equipment. The step that followed has not left me. Walk to the front door. Turn the key to the right, not to lock it, to unlock it. Return to the sofa. Place your hands flat on your knees. Look at the camera without moving until the timer reaches 0. I did it. The sound of the latch felt indecent. The timer counted down between the 2 frames, one measuring my quiet room, one measuring the cold garage light. When it reached 0, nothing happened. The strip light hummed. My flat stayed still. The stream blinked. The bottom frame vanished. A last message told me to pack the gear back into the rucksack and leave it outside my door, that the bag in the yard would be collected, and that there would be no further contact if I kept a simple rule about keeping quiet. The window closed itself. The lamp made the same pool of light on the same rug. In the morning, the news said the missing woman had been found. The language was careful again. No details. A car on a lane near the river. A change of tone from urgent to grateful. I stared at my kitchen tiles until the grout lines blurred. I replaced the front door lock. I replaced the smoke alarm. I found 2 more lenses during the week. One above the boiler, one in a vent. No more messages arrived. The link that had started the errands no longer loaded. The envelopes ended. The world did not. I did not write a statement or walk into a station. I imagined both and then imagined the questions and the looks and the slow crawl through a system that would want every wrapper and every step. I did small things instead. I started using small shops where the staff see you often enough to notice a mood. I nodded to people I recognized. I put up my own camera that points at my front door and records ordinary arrivals and departures. I told myself it was for safety, knowing it was for penance. This is the shape of it, stripped to romance. A bland link, boring steps, envelopes under metal, a parcel on a bin lid as a bin lorry rolls up, a rucksack containing a script, a stream with a counter that ticks and a room that hums, a house that reveals how easily it can be mapped, a door that unlocks because the person who lives there turns the key, a news item that takes less than a minute, a person like me who falls silent because speaking would make the mess heavier and not cleaner. If you want something to hold on to, take this. Plain tasks can be part of extraordinary harm, and harm can be scheduled with the tone used for parcel delivery. It does not need masks or jargon. It needs ordinary hands, ordinary streets, and a willingness to follow lists without asking why. I gave my walking and my camera and my quiet to a system designed to look harmless. If I could rewind to the hour before the first walk, I would make tea, put my phone in a drawer, and sit on my hands until the feeling passed. I did not. I keep the first empty envelope in a drawer with batteries and old receipts. Sometimes I put it on the table and stare until it stops being stationary and starts being the whole story in miniature. Cheap paper, a fold that holds shape, a method disguised as nothing special. If you want a final line, it is only this: I should have left it alone. The boring parts made the worst parts possible, and the scariest moment was not the stream or the timer. It was turning my own key and knowing I was the one who had unlocked the door. I live with it.